We have a packed evening, a lot of different things on our agenda, and we also have two public comment opportunities. I just remind folks that public comment is a little bit different at study session. It's not just about everything and anything. That's reserved for our regular meetings. It's specific to topics that are on the agenda, and it's actually an opportunity for you to be able to participate in a more comprehensive way in council's dialogue. So if you would like to take the opportunity to speak on any of these issues, we encourage you to do so. If it's just simply don't like or like, we'd ask that you reserve that for a public hearing. And we will go ahead and open the first round of public comment. And first on our agenda, Ms. Weathers, did you sign up to speak before or after? You're up. Thank you. I don't know why this doesn't say that.
Good evening. My name is Sandy Weathers. I'm a resident of Ward 3, and I am the co-founder and vice president of 501c3 Zero Waste Services. A lot of the work that I've done has focused on micro-recycling and hard-to-recycle items. However, today I would like to speak about the building code update. The reality is the majority of our waste comes from building construction and demolition. So although my focus is smaller, what we need to do to get the bigger bang for our buck is focus on this area, and I'm really excited to see the amended changes to the building code update, and I just wanted to offer my personal support of the update. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is the shopping carts. I just wanted to offer a quick idea. I do not envy any of you working on this issue right now. I know it's very complicated. There's a lot of factors involved. I just wanted to throw an out-of-the-box idea out there. So in other countries where people rely heavily on public transportation, people are dependent on finding a way to getting their groceries from the store to home. Here, what I've noticed is where the shopping carts congregate tends to be the bus stop locations. I happen to live by one, so I see the shopping carts regularly, and it just occurred to me that the reason why they're congregating there is because people are using the shopping carts to take their groceries to the stop. So it's not a 100% solution, but if we find a way to alleviate the burden for people who are using public transportation, we might help alleviate this problem. So in other countries where public transportation is more utilized, these devices are used. This gadget will let you carry 50 pounds of groceries. So if you have two of them, you can carry 100 pounds of groceries. They're just not common here. I think a lot of people don't know about them. In Japan, for example, grocery stores give them out. So they want you to shop at their store. They want to make your life easier. They're handed to customers. These are sold for 99 cents in other countries at stores similar to dollar stores. So I don't think this would be very expensive to implement. I think if the city were to partner with RTD and with the grocery stores themselves, it would pay for itself. And it's just partially educating the public on finding another way to get your groceries home. I also wanted to mention that I want to call on, channel John F. Kennedy. It's not about gosh, somebody help me out here. It's not what you can do for your country. It's, yeah, you guys got it. Anyway, sorry. I just think if we all work together and, took a little initiative to just make an effort and try to solve this on our own, this problem is going to be big. if everyone can just take a little bit of time, if you are able-bodied, please, if you see a shopping cart, please take it back and help the city while the city's trying to figure this out. And that's it. And this is for Councillor Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, you're up next.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening. Michael DeRoja, I'm in Ward 4. I've got a little small business. It's called Michael the Solar Guy, LLC. I just want to draw upon one point with sustainability and the movement towards clean energy, solar in particular. With each job that, or each sale or each resident that decides to go solar, you're supporting quite a cast of people that are working in this industry. These are good paying local jobs with solar. So if you have ordinance that is encouraging solar, you're encouraging jobs. I just wanted to make that point tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Amara? Okay. All right, that's all that's signed up. So before we go into our first presentation, which is building code updates, I want to welcome somebody to the dais, or actually to the lower portion of our dais, and that's Ben Goldstein, who is our new Deputy City Manager, and this is his first meeting. So welcome. We are glad to have you and excited to work with you at the City of Lakewood. All right. Mr. Hutchinson, it's a busy night for you, sir. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, City Council, and all others who are hearing or viewing this. The first topic on your agenda tonight, subsequent to the public discussion that you just had, was about the building code update. This is a very routine item. It just doesn't happen real often. Cities all across the country, actually internationally, adopt building codes routinely. In fact, all of these documents that you'll hear a little bit about are actually from the International Code Council. We'll be going through those page by page. Are you off next week? But I did want to point out that they're pretty routine. It's the normal item that is the building code for most local governments around the country and internationally. There are, however, local amendments. These documents are created by an internationally composed group of people in the industry, of municipalities, people on all sides of all the different kinds of topics that are addressed in those. After they go through that vetting process, which takes months and months and months, they then come to each of the local communities, and we do the same kind of thing given our local circumstances. So there are multiple entities that are involved in reviewing them, making comments on them. We look at plans that have already been adopted by the city. We talk with our local fire district, because local fire districts, as you read, there are actually 3 that serve the city of Lakewood in one form or another. And then ultimately the Board of Appeals that you appoint will make a recommendation to you about this ordinance. They've not made that recommendation yet, only because we wanted to get past this evening and see if there were any changes before they made their final recommendation. They have had several meetings, as you'll hear in a few minutes, about what you've got before you this evening. In addition to the information specific to the building code, you're also going to have a little educational interlude in the middle of the presentation from the West Metro Fire Protection District's fire marshal. And I think that'll be helpful to put some things in context. It doesn't really affect the recommendation, but we wanted to give you an opportunity to hear that, because it's a topic that comes up occasionally, and we'll hold on those specifics for just a little bit. Our recommendation tonight is asking you for a consensus, really, to bring the ordinance forward that would adopt these codes with the amendments that you see in your packet. And with that, I'm going to introduce the main presenter this evening, Ms. Ann Hine, who is the city engineer for the city of Lakewood. Ms. Hine?
Good evening.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. Thanks for the opportunity to give you a brief presentation on our efforts with the Lakewood Building Code update. Tonight we'll talk a little bit about what the building code is and what it applies to, the process that we've gone through to date to adopt a new code. We'll do a brief overview of the proposed ordinance, and then we'll open it up to City Council discussion. The building official, Mike Sizemore, is here. Bruce Kroll, the West Metro Fire District Fire Marshal, is here, and then Jonathan Wachtel and Lynn Coppage from the Sustainability Division are here. So what is this Lakewood Building Code? As Jay said, it's all of this, which are published codes. They're published by the International Code Council and the National Fire Protection Association. And then it's a series of local amendments to the published codes. So the published codes give us the opportunity to provide some consistency among other jurisdictions in the metro area and in the whole country. And then the local amendments in our Title 14 of the Municipal Code give us the opportunity to tailor these codes to our specific needs. So these codes, plus our local amendments, cover all new construction in Lakewood, residential and commercial. It covers all the systems within the buildings and energy conservation and fire protection. It applies to new construction, but it does, and buildings that are being modified, but it does not apply to existing buildings. So there's no requirement in the building code to retrofit a building to bring it up to the current code, unless you're doing work in the building. We've been spending about the last 18 months on this adoption process. We started with a staff review of the newly published codes and a review of our local amendments to see what we needed to change and what had changed in the published codes. Then we engaged our Board of Appeals, which is a body appointed by City Council. Its members need to have some building construction experience or experience with the building codes. And that's because one of their main tasks is to provide a recommendation to you regarding building code updates. So we met with them in several study sessions. They support the ordinance as we've presented it tonight. And we expect that they'll act on a resolution at their next regular meeting, which is next Tuesday. We'll update them on the discussion tonight, and then, barring any major changes, we expect them to act on a resolution. That resolution will be provided to you as we move forward in the adoption process. We've had a fairly robust stakeholder engagement process. Some of the groups on this list are your typical stakeholders. They are affected by the building code. Some are our enforcement partners. Some are internal and external groups in the city. And then this time around, we had a lot of advisors specifically related to energy conservation and energy efficiency. The stakeholders are very familiar with the published codes, so most of our discussion was related to our local amendments. The local amendments in the draft ordinance fall into several categories. We use the local amendments to define our administrative processes related to fees and how we issue permits. Each of the published codes has a section about how to issue permits and what to charge for them, but we keep local control of that, so our ordinance has an administrative chapter. We also use amendments to define local conditions, such as our local wind load and our local snow load. We're using local amendments to support other city goals, such as goals of the sustainability plan. There are some local amendments that are required by Colorado law. And in the draft ordinance, you'll see, in the red line draft ordinance, you'll see several amendments that are just crossed out. Those are no longer needed. Some of those provisions are now in the published codes, and some are related to technologies that no longer are needed. Your packet also has a memo that has very specific information about local amendments per each one of the published codes. I'm not going to go through that in any detail, but I did want to bring your attention to a couple of the amendments, or a few of the amendments that raised the most input from stakeholders. The first is residential fire sprinklers. These are sprinklers for single-family duplex townhome buildings not commercial buildings. That requirement is in the International Building Code. This residential fire sprinkler requirement is in the International Residential Code. It first appeared in 2009, and at that time, Lakewood decided to amend that requirement out of the code. So the current Lakewood Building Code does not have this requirement, and the proposed Lakewood Building Code does not have this requirement. The Board of Appeals discussed this, and they support the amendment that removes the requirement. And as part of that discussion, you heard from Jay Hutchison earlier, the West Metro Fire Marshal presented a presentation to the Board of Appeals. He will give you an abbreviated presentation to educate you on the residential fire sprinklers. So with that, I'll introduce Bruce Kroll, the West Metro Fire Marshal.
Good evening, Mr. Kroll.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and council members. Thanks for giving me a minute to talk to you this evening. First of all, I wanted to say working with Mike and Ann has been a phenomenal process. They're very progressive thinkers, and they're taking the whole picture into account of how these code changes affect the whole community. So it's been a pleasure to work with them on this proposal tonight. So to start with, what I wanted to accomplish tonight was just give you a little bit of insight to what some of the issues are with fire sprinklers and why they're in the code to begin with. It's not a simple answer. It doesn't solve all the issues. There's a lot of stakeholders that need to be part of this discussion. So this is something I hope to just give you an idea of the background to it as we go on throughout the years and talk about this as a solution. So the problem, as the fire service sees it, it's overwhelmingly a problem in home fires. You can see there 92% of the civilian fire deaths are in homes, an average of 3,000 deaths in homes a year. Lakewood averages over 300 fire events a year with 2 to 3 fatalities. So some of that issue comes from new construction methods. So as construction gets better, more efficient, more engineered, it also doesn't last very long under fire. A lot of lightweight construction means that the buildings don't survive very long. Also, probably a lot of the houses that we grew up in, something like the kitchen was its own room. Now the kitchen is part of the whole first floor. So if a fire started in the kitchen in our heyday, it stayed there. Now, as soon as it starts, the smoke goes through the whole house. So those are some of the reasons that new construction is a little bit more fire hazardous than it used to be. And the contents, the furniture burns faster and hotter. If you want to get an example of this, there's a lot of videos on YouTube, or you can come to our annual family fire muster, and we show a demonstration of that. So one of the solutions that the code proposes is residential fire sprinklers. And that's, like Ann said, the sprinklers in actually a single-family home. So some of the benefits to that, 18 gallons a minute. That's about what that sprinkler head flows, and only one goes off. It's not like in the movies where they all go off. Versus 180 gallons a minute that comes out of a fire hose. So much bigger drenching going on when we show up as opposed to sprinklers in the house. $1.35 per square foot is the national average. That doesn't mean that's the average in Colorado. It could be quite a bit more expensive in Colorado. So that's why I say this is not a simple solution, but it's worth a discussion. It would be installed by plumbers or contractors. Flexible tubing now makes this an easier process. Circulated through the household plumbing so it doesn't get stale water in it. And again, only the sprinkler head over the fire operates, not the whole house full of sprinklers goes off. Smoke alarms don't set off the sprinklers. And there's no freezing if they're installed correctly, which when it's installed by plumbers, that should be the case. So that's a little example of a fire behind the chair extinguished by sprinklers versus one extinguished by firefighters. So whether or not you want to wait for that. So again, this is not a simple idea. It takes stakeholders, and over time we hope to include the Home Builders Association, the water purveyors, city staff in this discussion.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
We did have some specific stakeholder input regarding this amendment. The water providers would handle this requirement inconsistently. As you know, there are 21 water providers within the city of Lakewood, and they all had a slightly different way of handling it, so there's no predictability for the builders. In some cases, a separate fire line would be required, and that would require an additional tap fee, which could add significantly to the cost in both the water tap and the sewer tap. The other issue that the water providers raised is liability. They sometimes have to turn off water to a home based on non-payment of a bill. That would also turn off the fire sprinkler, and they're worried about their liability if that should occur and a fire occurs. The Home Builders Association of Metro Denver supports removing the fire sprinkler requirement. But even though it's not a requirement, it still remains an option. So a builder or prospective home buyer could request the residential fire sprinklers in their home, and we have a way of doing that. West Metro Fire has agreed to do all the plan review and the building inspection, and we can integrate that into the normal plan review we do here at the city and the normal inspection we do throughout the construction. The other series of amendments that garnered a lot of interest were the amendments we added in supporting the sustainability plan goals. These are related to the 3 topics that you see. For energy efficiency, we are proposing solar readiness in commercial and residential buildings and electrical vehicle charging readiness in residential and commercial buildings. And that's an amendment for energy efficiency on top of what the base code requires. So we're moving from the 2009 Energy Conservation Code to the 2015 code, and that provides about a 20% increase in energy efficiency for a new building built under the 2015 code. That's before we get to any of the amendments. We're proposing one amendment for water efficiency that reduces or prohibits the use of a single-pass cooling system where water comes in, cools, and then is discharged. So it has to recycle. We're also proposing amendments that will reduce waste, construction waste and demolition waste. There are provisions for both residential and commercial construction waste recycling and demolition waste recycling. So in summary, we're proposing to move from the 2009 International Suite of Codes and the 2011 National Electric Code to the 2015 International Codes and the 2017 National Electric Code. And we are recommending your concurrence to move forward with adoption of the ordinance.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Hine. So I just would like to mention, too, to those folks who may be tuning in or in the audience, we had a great opportunity to have some time with the building code recommendations. We appreciate the red line. Actually, it's a blue line version. So thank you. That was helpful to see where we're changing things. And I think there'll be a few questions. And again, the ask for council is to recommend moving forward for adoption, or at least for a public hearing on adoption. And we will start with questions. Councilor Abel.
One of the things I hear most about is attainable and affordable housing. A number of these things would probably increase the price of a new house. And I'm wondering if we have any figures on that. And we have to certainly balance sustainability with livability, but and I'm the guy who repairs my own appliances because I don't want to see new ones put on the market unless they have to be. They have a huge carbon footprint. But how does that stack out? What will this, if we enact all of these things, solar fitting for new homes, the recycling of old driveways, all of that sort of thing. How does this affect that? we also mentioned, pardon? Oh, do you want to answer them one at a time? Or I think that would be something that might take some study and bring back to us at before second reading.
Each time the building codes are updated, there are new provisions in the published codes as well as the local amendments. Some increase cost, some reduce cost. So we have not evaluated the changes in the published codes, what that would do to, say, an average home cost. We do know that the energy efficiency amendments that we're proposing add a small cost. It's readiness. It's not installing the equipment. So the solar readiness is providing a pathway and a location on the service panel so that it's easier to retrofit this later. It's not requiring the solar panels.
I understand that, but I don't understand small costs. I don't understand might and that. What I would like to know is have some fairly firm figures of what this might add to the cost of a new home. If you could bring that to us when we consider the ordinance, I would appreciate it. There are also some mention of some terms in here I'm not sure about. Lodging houses. Is that short-term rentals? And I'm sorry I didn't mark down what exactly where these things can be found.
It's a fire provision for live work areas and for lodging homes.
There you go.
Houses.
What's a lodging home?
We have some bed and breakfasts in Lakewood that are allowed by the zoning ordinance, and we didn't have anything in the building code that addressed how we would handle fire. So the building code calls them lodging homes. It would be regulated under the zoning code as a bed and breakfast.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Under 1609.4, we talk about exposure C under exposure category. What is an exposure category and what is exposure C?
Is this in the residential code?
It's 16.09.4. So maybe it's 14.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mike Sizemore, I'm the building official.
Yes, sir.
Exposure categories are based on weather conditions and other various things, and it's part of the design equation that a design professional will use. That's why it's in Chapter 16. We typically call Chapter 16 our engineering chapter. That's a design professional chapter. There's a couple of different exposures. There's A, B, C. There may even be a D.
And they're rated on the severity of weather conditions?
Correct. Yeah, and other things as well. And then some of it is based on the landscape and also the how many buildings you have, how many high-rise buildings or low-rise or mid-rise, and various other things.
Okay. Yep. Y'all are very close to these things and know what all those things mean, and we're just kind of grasping in the dark sometimes. It's not something you can look up easily. Also, and I've wondered about this for some time, that showers are treated differently than bathtubs, and they require a different size drain. We're requiring a different size drain here. Most showers are taken in bathtubs. So why is there a greater requirement for a standalone shower, a shower pan, than there would be for a shower that's part of a bathtub setup? And that's been part of code for some time. I know this because I put in a shower pan and went and tried to get a fixture that fit the 1930s drain for it, and the everything had changed since then. So, what's the logic?
Well, it's the capacity of the shower pan, I believe, and you get that requires it to be a
The
large.
drain faster? Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's it for now.
Great. Councillor Roybal.
Thank you, Mayor. Got a couple questions for you. The first one, I read through 109 pages of information, and I just wanted to bring to your attention, I'm a 203K HUD inspector, but one of the commonalities, and I wanted to bring to your attention, you talked about the codes. You talked about a lot of things, but I didn't hear anything about smoke detectors and the upgrade on how they're doing, along with the carbon monoxide testers, and how would that be updated in the new buildings. But the big one I want to talk about also is the radon gas, the radon in the basements or in different areas. Can you guys give us a little bit of information about that, please?
Carbon monoxide detectors and smoke detectors are both outlined in several of our codes. We've actually made an amendment to be better in sync with the state requirements on the location of carbon monoxide detectors in residential units. The building code is quite aware of the need for carbon monoxide, the safety requirements. The same with fire smoke detectors. They've been in the code for some time. Carbon monoxide detectors, I believe, were inserted in 2012. The state recognized the need for them earlier and passed a law. Regarding radon, we have addressed radon. We've adopted Appendix F, I believe it is, which is a radon section. And we based our amendments on the studies that were done back the previous code adoption. There was extensive studies done related to radon. And
when was that done, if I may ask? What year? Just trying to get a general grasp of it to see if it may we may want to take a closer look at it again and maybe ask for an update or something to kind of move forward. Technology is growing very rapidly, and I just want to make sure that when we bring all our codes up that we meet with the technology of today's standards.
Right. I believe it was 2012 when that study was done and a separate ordinance was adopted. Right. The radon provisions that we've adopted are the current provisions that are in the 2015 building code. We've made some minor amendments to those that are specific to Lakewood, but I do believe that they're the most up-to-date radon codes. We've had other cities ask us about, as a matter of fact, Jeffco was asking us how what our radon ordinance looked like. They wanted to see a copy of it, and we ran our building code and radon provisions by the health department of Jeffco, and they were very approved of those.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yep.
I just wanted to make sure that we were current and up to date with that particular, the radon issue. I think the chief would also acknowledge that in a small house with radon and they live in the basement, we tend to lose a lot of lives like that. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. And just for reference, Mr. Roybal, 14.02 talks about the carbon monoxide, and then 14.04 deals with the smoke detectors. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. My questions are a little scattered as I went down. First, I'd like to thank Bruce for your update on the fire restrictions, and I appreciate the intent of the mandated sprinklers, but I actually support an opt-in. I've had a chance to do a little bit of research on that, and it sounds like it could add as much as $20,000 to a new home. And I am constantly hearing and being reminded of affordability. So there's some things that homeowners are going to have to decide if they want to go forward on that. So I support the opt-in. I'd love to see us mandated, however, for the motels on Colfax. That I could support, Bruce. Okay. Let me just kind of jump around here. On page 5 here, we've got that there's a requirement to remove existing roofing layers, and you can't place a new roof on an old. Does that mean that all of the old existing roofing product needs to come off? And if we're requiring that, are we actually sending an inspector out when that is done prior to the roofing fabric going up?
We are requiring that. We are not doing that particular inspection, but we still are trying to the best that we can to verify that that has been done. The reason we're not doing that inspection because it would add, in some cases, a whole day to that project. A lot of times roofers come in, they want to be gone in and out in one day. Sometimes it's longer, especially if they're doing it next to you, it seems like. But that's why we don't do that inspection, but that is a requirement, yes.
But there's actually no way if we frankly know if it's being done.
Well, again, we can do some non-destructive testing and visualization, and we can generally see, our roofing inspectors who've been doing this a long time can generally tell if it's been done or not. Not always, but generally we can.
Okay, this one's a little near and dear to my heart. I had a new roof replaced at my dad's, and the new roof leaked. And so I'm, kind of wondering more about that process. I saw on page 5, too, the interest in swimming pools and spas, and it applies to residential. This is on page 5, the first batch of it. Commercial spas and hot tubs. And could you please describe the application for hot tubs? Because many homes go and just put one in. And are we actually now asking? I'm not familiar if we're asking for permits. And talk to me. What does that look like, please?
With the swimming pool and spa code, which is a new code, of course, swimming pools and spas were regulated prior to that in fragmented places throughout the codes, plumbing code, building code, electrical code. Does require permits for spas unless they're portable. So some spas can be plugged in, simply plugged in, you put water in them, they're ready to go. Those necessarily would not require a permit from us. But a permanent spa that's anchored.
Hot tub, if you will.
Pardon me?
A permanent hot tub.
Yes, ma'am. Hot tub or spa.
Okay.
Hot tub, yes. Would require a permit.
A permanent hot tub one does. Okay. And under the mechanical code, I just recently learned that we need to have a permit in order to clean the AC condenser on the roof. Please, is that accurate? And talk to me about that. That seems to be a little bit of a difficulty for some businesses.
I would consider that maintenance, and you'd not be required to get a permit for that.
So a permit is not required to clean the condenser on an AC?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Then I was given bad information. On page 6, there's language regarding requiring solar-ready construction. Could you please talk a little bit about that? What does that look like, and what are we looking at in terms of cost?
Certainly. The cost, I don't know that we have that information. I think that's something that we'll try to capture and bring back to the next meeting. The requirement for solar, there's a commercial requirement, and there's also a residential requirement. The commercial requirement is built into the code. The residential requirement is something that we've added. Basically, we're talking about being ready to install solar. That means that your building, whether you're residential or commercial, needs to be oriented properly, and there's specific orientation calculations that are provided that give you the optimal sunlight and things of that nature. On the residential side, we're asking for additional space for the electrical circuits and what have you, and have them labeled. We're also asking on the front end for proper load tests. So we want to make sure if someone does opt to put in solar that they have the appropriate structural roof members to support that already, so they won't have to go back and do that at a later date.
Okay. This is something I'm not at all familiar with, and it was on page 7 regarding wind speed. Could you please talk a little bit about that?
I can.
Yeah, I'm not sure even what it means.
It's in chapter 16. Again, wind speed is something that the design professionals have to identify for a particular area before they can actually design a building. The Denver region is in what's called a special wind region. So there are no maps in the building code. If you look in the building code, chapter 16, there's a couple of wind maps in there. It tells you, for example, in southern Florida, the wind design is 150 miles an hour. For various places, it's identified because there's enough evidence to put together a map. However, in a special wind zone, there is not. The wind changes all the time. The wind can be extremely high or higher than normal. So what we rely on is a study that was completed by Association of Engineers back in 2010, and that's a basis for the Denver region to define the wind speed. And that's what we've used, obviously, and that's what everybody in this region will use to identify wind speed. Now, you'll see it's different in various places. It's going to be much higher in parts of Jeffco than it would be here in Lakewood, and it's going to be a little lower on the east side of Denver.
I'm still the slow child. How does this apply to the building code?
Yeah, it's the design parameters that are formulated based on the wind speed. So, for example, if you're going to build a building and your wind speed is a design factor of 110, or your wind speed is 110, you need to make sure that your building is designed to withstand that wind. If it's not, then
the orientation of the building on the land.
There's a lot of factors that go into that. It changes certainly. The higher you go, it depends on the type of building. There's different risk categories of buildings. There's 4 different categories of buildings, 1 through 4. 4 being hospitals and police stations and things like that we would like to see standing if all else fails. But there are minimum standards that certainly we want to make sure that everybody is safe.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's been mentioned in here, new language that basically is mandating construction materials that are taken off of a site to be reused. Again, do we know the added cost to what that is going to be? Won't that add staff time? And how does that figure in? And I'd like to know if other cities are doing this. I'm actually having a hard time with that one.
I'd like to ask Jonathan Wachtel from the Sustainability Division to answer that question. He does have some information.
Okay.
Thanks, Counselor. Jonathan Wachtel, Sustainability Division, and I don't know if I can answer all the cost questions that you might have, but we do have a bit of research on a lot of the added sustainability elements, and I can talk a little bit about what we do know, and then there's probably more that you'd like. So you asked about the Solar Ready requirements and if that would add cost. What we've been able to find so far is that it shouldn't add cost. And the reason for that is that it's really a design issue. So what we're asking developers to do is when they build that building and when they build that home, to make sure there's a clear pathway from the box to the roof so that wiring can, in the future, be placed in that pathway, and that the roof is designed so that the portion of the roof, if it's suitable, because it doesn't apply to all developments, it has to do with developments that are sited in a way that makes sense and have roofs at an appropriate pitch, that you leave those portions of the roof available as a designated space so it's ready to go and take the solar installation in the future. So really it's mostly a design issue on that, and we reached out to some other cities. City of Seattle responded that after they put their solar-ready residential rules in place, they basically came up with a zero-cost estimate to what that should cost because it was a design issue. Certainly that's one city, so we can probably do more research and make sure that's really the case, but that's where we're at right now. On the construction and demolition, it depends on materials. And I think what's important to note is the materials that are included in the list. We did our research into, first of all, did they make up a significant portion of the waste stream so that it was worth the added effort for the builder to have to separate this stuff and manage the site? And then is there an outlet where these things can be recycled in proximity to Lakewood? So it makes it reasonable. So the costs that we have researched, concrete is about $3 to $6 a ton, and that makes up 30 to 70% of our construction and demolition waste stream. Asphalt's the next largest percentage of the waste stream, somewhere between 14 and 29%. That costs about $1 to $5 a ton to recycle. Wood is between 7 and 17% of your typical C&D waste stream, and that costs between $2.40 and $8 a ton, depending on the wood. So we do have those numbers. And then I actually looked this up earlier today. If you took, this is just two businesses that I happen to have their information on their website. So the cost at the Front Range landfill to dump a ton of concrete is $56 if you're going to landfill it. And at the Allied Recycling facility in Commerce City, you can dump an entire end dump trailer, which can carry about 15 tons of concrete for $75. So that comes out to $5 a ton to recycle it, as opposed to $56 a ton to take it to the landfill. So the issue generally in a lot of these, we found this is the case, is not necessarily that the challenge here is the cost of recycling these products. The challenge is going to be, and it's probably going to be a little difficult, and we're going to have to work with developers to manage it, is how are they managing these materials on site? How are they setting up the different dumpsters, making sure that contractors and subcontractors are actually putting the right materials so they don't contaminate the waste in one, and facilitating the fact that now instead of throwing this all into one big dumpster, they've got to sort it on site. So it's more of probably a logistical challenge, and any expenses that might be incurred are probably from that process of resizing their dumpsters to be appropriate now that they're spreading their waste across various containers.
Okay, do we know how other cities are handling this, or is this in other cities?
This is in other cities. I have here somewhere a list of some of the other cities that have these. In Colorado, both Boulder and Fort Collins have ordinances, and ours is very similar. What we're proposing is very similar to Fort Collins. We were able to speak with them quite a bit to get their experiences. But Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Austin, Texas, I've got a list here. King County, Washington, Cook County, Illinois, Evanston, Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin. So I've got quite a list here that we can share of cities that are requiring construction and demolition waste. And what we're proposing is really kind of an entryway into that. Some of them are very robust and have like diversion metric requirements saying you must divert 80% of your waste, and they don't care how you do it. And we thought that would be a little more challenging. We thought, let's identify the waste streams that we know make up a big percentage of the waste and that we know there's an outlet and we think are affordable, and let's start there.
Because I agree with the intent as far as recycling, but what I am hearing at this point almost on a weekly basis is the difficulty in getting permits in our city and how hard it is for contractors to actually build in the city of Lakewood. And I'm not real comfortable with going forward on this. the way it's worded at any rate.
So I'm going to go with some follow-ups while Jonathan's here. Councilor Abel, you had originally asked this question, so I'm going to let you follow up while Mr.
I
Watt.
did, thank you, and that is exactly the information I was looking for. So don't worry about it next time we have it in hand. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, may I please finish then?
One more second. Does anybody else, while Mr. Wachtel's here, have questions along that line? Okay.
Oh, actually, I do.
Councilor Gutwein, go ahead.
Thank you. So that's, first of all, really helpful. Thank you very much. My question is, so like you mentioned, this is going to be somewhat of a learning curve because it's going to be doing things a new way. How can we assist the community as they adjust, like our building community and contract communities?
I mean, I think that's a really key component to how we can be successful. You're speaking about the construction and demolition waste. So the concept is that we will require a plan, a waste management plan at the point of a permit. So they'll identify where on site they're going to collect these items that we've identified, assuming, for those that they will be generating as waste. And then when they're done, they'll basically turn in receipts that say that they took those things to the dump or to be recycled appropriately. But I think what's important is that we make sure that we have available to them all of the potential places they could take this. A set of resources. So here's where you can dispose of all of these appropriately. The University of Colorado. Boulder actually has an incredible website dedicated to this, where it has you can search by material and it has all the recyclers in the state, and they keep that up to date. So that's a starting spot for us that we use to vet this concept in the first place. And then I think we'll probably need to treat this very gently. I mean, I think there's going to be challenges. We know that, and I think this needs to be I think we anticipate taking a very cooperative approach. Why is this hard? Getting feedback from the contractors that are doing this. I don't think our intent here is to rule with an iron fist. I think it's to try to divert some of our waste and support our goals and learn as we go and work collaboratively. So hopefully that helps.
Councilor Harrison, you had a follow-up.
Yeah, I think this is still yours, Jonathan. We talked about the readiness for both the electrical vehicles and the solar. Would that also include, I know you said have space on the roof and a place in the garage. Does that mean also running the wires to the electrical box? Or is it just having a space in the box for whatever voltage would be required? What do you...
Two separate answers, I believe, if we're talking the solar or if we're talking the electric vehicle.
I am asking both of those questions.
So I believe with the solar, it's just a space. There's no actually pre-wires required.
Okay.
I'm just
Thank you.
behind me here. With the electric vehicle infrastructure, it's a little more complicated. So on a single-family home or a townhome or anything building its own garage, that will be pre-wired to be ready to go.
Just a pathway or conduit, not actually the pre-wire.
So the box itself wouldn't have to be live. It's just that you want the wire run in the conduit and ready to go should they decide that they want to do that.
It's actually space in the box to add a new circuit and then a conduit between the garage and the main panel. Not necessarily the wire in the conduit.
Okay, thank you.
And that's for the garage piece. And then on a larger development, the requirement will be will basically, the intent is to relay back to the zoning ordinance. And so we also are examining parking requirements and looking at what kind of requirements might be appropriate for electric vehicles in the zoning ordinance. And then if it's required to have a certain number of spaces in a larger development be EV ready, that would trigger the building code requirement.
Thank you.
And we do have those costs too. Basically, it's a third of the price to do this ahead of time than to retrofit. So, surface parking space might be $1,000 to $2,000 a spot to wire ahead of time, and $3,000 to $5,000 to go back and put that infrastructure in place.
Thank you, Councilor Johnson. There's quite a few folks lined up, so let's.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll hurry right along. On page 9, we've got language that actually gives the city manager the ability to designate and authorize waiving or reducing fees. And I think we really need to take another look at this. The public perception on that could be favoritism. And I don't want to see you put in that position, Kathy. I think that's something that we should be pulling from this. I'm not comfortable with that.
Could you show us where that's at?
It's on page 9. I'm sorry, it's actually page 2 in the blue line version, and the same, page 2 in the black line version.
Okay. Okay, and then more on page 9. There's language in there talking about governmental entities exempt from fees. And I'm just curious, since the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless is pretty heavy on our thoughts right now. If they don't have fees to build, they'd be on government land, or you're going to have to talk with me on this one. Number one, how do we know what people are building and if it fits in a neighborhood?
If I may answer that, the Lakewood Building Code does not apply to federal buildings, state buildings, and public school buildings, either primary or secondary public school buildings.
That's the point. It doesn't apply to the...
It does not apply. So
build
those
what they want.
those buildings are built under the state building code or a federal building code that is similar to the published code.
Okay, how does Lakewood know then if a governmental entity is building something on their property? How does that fit in our neighborhood, and do we get government or do we get community input then? I mean,
Maybe I
do we
can,
not have any say if any other governmental entity is building something?
perhaps I can help clarify a little bit.
Yeah, please.
When Ann said that it doesn't apply, that's not because we've excluded it from the code. That's because other laws don't allow us to include it in the code. So it's not available to the city of Lakewood to regulate those kinds of facilities. It's simply not something we have the option to do. On the federal center property, where the real estate is owned by the federal government, we also do not have any jurisdiction. Zoning codes, however, do apply throughout the city of Lakewood, so that deals with use, with the exception of property that is still federally owned on the federal center property, where the zoning codes do not apply, and there's not something Lakewood can do to make a change to that.
Okay.
Does that help? Or
A little bit, yeah.
how else can I help?
I'm just thinking, too, if a school wanted to build something new on land, do we have any input into that at all?
No.
There is a state statute dealing with public school construction and the separate one for charter school construction that generally requires the planning commission to take a look at the plans. As I recall, it's been a while since I've had to look at that, but and then make recommendations for changes. But ultimately, the school district has the final say as to whether to make those changes or not. I think the school board would review the recommendations of the city planning commission and decide whether to implement them or not. If that's specific to public schools and not to any of the other uses we're talking about.
And just because Lakewood High is high on our list of visibility right now, when it was rebuilt, the orientation on that property was changed, which is actually one of the puzzles of what's creating some of the problems on that land. So I was just curious about that. On page 11, we've got that if there is emergency work done, and the contractor goes ahead and does something in an emergent type way and didn't pull a permit, that if he doesn't get the permit by the next day, that we suspend or revoke the contractor's registration and permit fee is doubled? Is that new, or is that... Talk to me about that. And how many times has that happened?
This is a permit exemption that has been in our local amendments for many, many years. If a water heater fails on a Saturday, the contractor is not able to get a permit.
Right.
So we require them to get a permit on the following business day, which would be Monday. If they don't, it's the same as any other work without a permit. Then there's an investigation fee, and it essentially is a double permit fee. But we do issue a lot of permits for furnaces and hot water heaters after the fact because they're done overnight or over a weekend or over a holiday.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. How many times has it happened that somebody has failed to actually pull a permit immediately as soon as they could? And is that something that we're actually finding happens, a trend there?
Well, it's something that we may not necessarily know about. If someone's replaced a hot water heater over the weekend and we have no knowledge of it, we just don't have any statistics with that kind of information.
So in a way, it's not even enforceable.
In some cases, we know about it and it is enforceable. But this would be onerous to require a contractor to get a permit on a Friday night when there's no ability to get a permit.
I agree. Okay, on page 12, there's language in there of temporary occupancy, and then it says the final inspections have been met. Those don't seem to go together. You've got a temporary occupancy, but you've gotten a final inspection. I don't understand that.
In some cases, the building is finished and the building inspectors have completed all the final inspections, but there may be some site improvements that are not quite finished, and we don't want to hold up occupancy, so we issue a temporary certificate of occupancy, and then we track the remaining work to be done. And when that's complete, we'll convert the temporary certificate of occupancy to a final.
Thank you. And you've already been asked about the shower waste. Do other cities also have this kind of language where you have to have specific diameter for the outlet in a shower, or is this something that Lakewood is doing alone? Or because when I read that, it just seemed like it jumped out at you.
Well, I don't have the exact number of other cities that may do that, but certainly there are some cities that do, and a lot of it's based on best practices.
Okay.
The codes aren't perfect, certainly.
Right.
So, and then a lot of it's based on this one is not, but some of it's based on regional criteria. But this one's based on best practices and what we feel works best.
Okay.
And other cities do it, but I'm sorry I don't have that information exactly which ones.
Okay, thank you. On page 22, there was language that says that we provide flexibility to permit use of determined approaches to achieve compliance. I love that. I thought that had a very nice ring to it, the way it was stated, and I just wanted to say that. Let's see, and this actually is for Bruce again, just because Lakewood High School is kind of on our radar right now. On page 40, actually, it was talking about emergency vehicles and having an unobstructed width not less than 24 feet and talking about a turning radius. There's interest in having one-way streets next to Lakewood High. The streets are quite narrow. I was there one time and took pictures with cars actually on both sides and a trash truck coming down, and literally there was this much space between the car and the trash truck. Has any consideration been given to this regarding Lakewood High and how it would apply to that? At least it's something I think we should be thinking about.
One of the commitments we did make during the discussion last week about Lakewood High School and the potential one-way idea was to collaborate with the fire district, and that hasn't happened yet. The collaboration hasn't happened yet, but we certainly will involve the fire marshal in that discussion.
Well, this is some language that maybe we should, be talking about at that time. Thank you. Oh, one more question. On page 47, it says you need a permit for different things, and then it has crossed off screen doors and storm doors, or that you don't need permits for, and then these were crossed off. Does that mean we now need to have a permit for screen doors and storm doors?
That amendment, when read without the red line, means that you do not need permits for replacement windows, essentially. We used to have we now have a requirement for replacement windows in order to meet the energy code, but we're finding that you can't buy a replacement window that doesn't meet the code. So we're no longer requiring a permit for replacement windows.
And for the screen doors and storm doors, do we need permits then?
That was always
backwards.
That was always in the local amendment as a not requiring a permit. So it's just all doors and windows now that do not require permits.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Harrison, you've been up for a while. And then Skilling, Gutwein, Lever, and Vincent for this first round.
All right. Thank you very much for all that you're doing. On the screening committee a couple of weeks ago when we were interviewing candidates for Board of Appeals, one of the things that we were told is that we need to update our codes. So hallelujah, we're doing exactly what they've been telling us. So thank you very much. My questions would be, this actually came from a constituent this summer when in the middle of the hail repair, he was really surprised that we didn't have a mid-roof inspection. That's what he called it, and I'm not sure I really understood it at the time, but he said in the east, before a roof could be completed, they wanted to have a mid-roof inspection, and he said he felt like some of his roofing was substandard, but he didn't know for sure. I mean, not the, what would it be, the wood that you put down? Yeah, the plywood. Oh, the OSB. Thank you. I'm learning language here. So I pass that along, that may be something that we want to consider. It would probably take more people, or it may be an optional inspection that a homeowner could ask for. So then the other thing, now I'm going to put my insurance agent hat on for just a minute. I believe we may see increased homeowners costs with a sprinkler system. And here's why, Mr. Kroll. We've seen in other places, now the way you described it, where the technology just goes over the fire right now, sounds wonderful. But in the past, when sprinkler systems have been installed in homes, there's as much damage from the sprinkler system as there was from the fire to the personal property. Now, people got out of there alive, and I'm not discounting that. I'm just giving you what the insurance company sees as the losses. So that may be a piece that we want to do a little bit more research on before we hang for that. Another constituent would love to have the ability to put turbines, for a lack of a better way. Dave, here's your turbine farm, on his roof. Just giving you what, and he wants it horizontal. I'm just telling you what they want. Okay.
So let me, questions? I'm sorry. We have a lot to do. Is that a question? Is there an opportunity?
Suggestion. Yeah, I don't know if it's even possible. So
I just want to make sure
yeah,
they're getting
that's
answered. So if that's is there a reason? Is that not in it? Or
that actually may be a combination of zoning code allowance. As I don't think that there's anything in the building permit or the building code that would prohibit that.
A turbine.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
No, keep it. I just want to get these answered.
And then the only other thing that I was concerned about is when we were talking about recycling of building. Number one, we're having a hard time finding a slash facility, let alone another place that we would be able to put that. Even though I love that idea, I think there's going to be a real cost attached to that, and I'm not sure how to solve that. I like the idea, but I'm not sure we have the answer yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Skilling.
Thank you, Mayor. The building updates we're doing now, when are we doing the next update? For example, is this the last time we're doing updates on the 2015 stuff and then the 2017 electrical?
Yes, if the 2015 I-codes and the 2017 electric code are adopted, they will be in place until the next code cycle. The 2018 I-codes are out, they've been published, and we'll start evaluating them. We'll go through that same process and be ready to adopt the 2018 codes in another 18 to 24 months.
That was my exact follow-up question, so thank you for that. And the only other question I had just quickly was, is there such a thing as being sprinkler ready, so halfway in between? So you talked about, I mean, obviously ripping out ceilings and going into water lines and all that on a retro is difficult, but is there anything you could possibly do to meet like halfway? For example, where the water's coming in, or adding an extra coupling or something that you can make it sprinkler ready? Was that talked about with all your groups?
That never came up. I don't know. It's probably possible to do some of the plumbing, although I don't know for sure. The whole residential sprinkler design needs to be compatible with the house, so I'm not sure that we can do just a blanket readiness like we can with solar or electric vehicle charging. And then each water provider would have to agree to how that system is going to work for that house. So I think we would need more design than maybe practicable for that.
Thank you.
Ms. Gutwein.
Thank you. Most of my questions were already answered, but just briefly, I want to make sure that I understand what Councilor Harrison was just asking about. If there's going to be is there going to be, are there facilities to accept the waste that we're talking about requiring diversion? And
Ms. Hodson.
All of the requirement, I'm going to go to the page here real quick, and I haven't got it. I do have it bookmarked. Hold on a second. So we have a list of the materials that need to get recycled, and I believe concrete, asphalt, metal materials, reused, will be donated, reused, or recycled. I'm on page 8 of the ordinance. And then all remaining materials such as doors, windows, cabinets, and fixtures will be recycled. So it doesn't include organic yard waste, which is the, or tree limbs, which is the slash concern. So I'm not sure I have an answer to that particular facility, but all of these materials we've vetted to make sure there are local businesses that.
How local?
In the metro area that would be reasonable to access.
do you have on that list somewhere to put a 1968 stove?
I'm sure that's got a lot of metal in it, and it's probably could fetch you some dollars. So.
Repair it. I'll come do it for you.
The old girl finally died, and but I can't part with it because I know it's got to. Anyway, I'll take that conversation offline. If anyone wants a 1968 old stove, it's what avocado green? No, what's the Harvest Gold? It's Harvest Gold. Thank you. Okay, so back to being serious. My last question is just: do other communities in the Denver metro area waive the sprinkler requirement?
They do. As a matter of fact, there's only a handful that have required sprinklers, like less than 6 probably in the whole state that I'm aware of.
Okay.
At this time.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Vincent.
I don't think I have any questions, except for, could we get another example other than Seattle? I guess I'm kind of apoplectic here that Seattle, that gets 4 hours of sun a year, has a solar requirement, and we have none. I like that one. Thank you.
For the record, he said Phoenix. Mr. LeBeer.
Are there, give me an example of the cities that have requirements for sprinklers in Colorado.
City of Golden, Westminster. That's all that comes to mind.
Okay.
There's just not many in this area. Golden and Westminster. I know Arapahoe County passed an ordinance that made it an option, but it wasn't mandatory. So it was an option that the builder had to provide to the buyer.
I think just to Councilman Abel's point a little bit about affordability. Affordability is also a big issue to me as well, but I'd also preface it by saying I just think it'd be helpful if we had some sort of cost-benefit analysis on some of these building codes. And what I mean by that is just what are some of the benefits we can expect to receive from having these updated building codes, other than just the regulatory side where, you know, we're updating our codes to meet compliance issues. I'm just wondering about, you know, are there benefits to air quality? Are there benefits as it relates to water pollution? Are there benefits related to, you know, landfill use? And I know we touched on some of that today, but I just want to mention it in part because a dirty secret of mine is I was born in Port Arthur, Texas, and I know I shouldn't be admitting that, but today you can still buy a house there for about $25,000 to $50,000, and it's pretty remarkable. But I don't know anybody who would want to buy a house there. In part, for example, it was in the New York Times recently. They identify that area as Cancer Alley, and that's because there are a ton of refineries around there. There isn't a whole lot of regulatory infrastructure there. And the Port Neches River, which is right next door to it, which is, I remember taking some boat rides up and down that quite frequently in my youth, is also a Superfund site. So if I'm a little strange, that could be why. Anyway, just want to throw that out there. So I am curious as to some of the benefits that we could be seeing from this as well. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. All right, so that exhausts the questions, and the recommendation is to move forward, and I certainly will be interested in seeing the Board of Adjustment. I mean, they're truly experts in this field, so I look forward to seeing their recommendation coming forward, and I think there's clear consensus to bring this, and just keep in mind as we continue to look at this that this is citywide, not, you know, specific to certain areas or neighborhoods. This takes in account all of our city. So there you go. Thank you. So next up, item 5 is just some education. This came from some council comments last year, as well as concerns that I think related to traffic noise and motorcycles, and a request was made, a better understanding how we deal with noise and noise associated issues. And again, I would like to welcome Mr. Hutchison. Thank you, Mr. Sizemore.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yes. We are a paperless council.
Most of our building plans examiners do use online versions of those documents, so we don't have as many copies as some might think. Thank you, Mayor. Again, Jay Hutchison, Director of Public Works. New topic, and this is not routine. This is unusual, although not unheard of. The City of Lakewood does have a noise ordinance. It's been modified a time or two in years past, not recently. But because some questions had arisen, we have prepared some information and included an acoustical consultant who will make a large portion of the presentation this evening. But I'll start. There have been a number of types of noise that have been discussed over the last probably a couple of years, and you've heard public comment on some of those. Some of you probably have not heard public comment on, but we've received comments in other ways. So tonight is an educational session. We don't have a recommendation, although if asked I might suggest one, but we'll get to that later. The real question here is this: does the City Council want to revise the noise ordinance? And if so, are there particular components of the noise ordinance that you'd like to revise? And I'll describe the noise ordinance here in a minute, and we'll come back to it a little bit later. An outline of it or some of its major features was included in your packet. If the City Council chooses to proceed with some consideration or reconsideration of part of the noise ordinance, then we'll probably need, we will need to provide another study session where we can talk about that specifically. We're not going to go into that level of depth on any of these items tonight to where a new ordinance could be discussed with specificity. So let me start by giving you a little bit of information about who's been involved in this process. There has been a multi-departmental team. There are representatives from each of these groups that are listed here in the room tonight, although I didn't look around, so I'm trusting that that's the case. I'm pretty sure it is. And then Mr. Surgeon is the acoustical expert that will visit with you here in just a few minutes. Let me spend a little bit of time on the existing ordinance so you have kind of a foundation to work from as we go into this broader discussion. This is not an ordinance that's structured around how many decibels different kinds of sound can produce and still be legal in the city of Lakewood. In fact, there are no decibel limitations in this ordinance, and I'll talk a little bit about why here in just a minute. That's certainly an option for some types of noise, a little more practical with some than others, and I'll touch on that as well. The first area that I want to talk about is a real objective measure that's within the noise ordinance, and that is time limitations. It's easy to tell if you're within the time limit or not for making noises such as picking up trash 300 feet from a hotel or running power equipment in the middle of the night. So these time limitations are very effective. They're easily administered. It's clear when they've been violated, and they're used for a variety of purposes. I won't go into much more detail than that right now. The second area is a couple of subjective components, and these are just that. They're subjective. It requires someone to assess the reasonableness of a noise. I think back to noise issues in college, which were fairly frequent. Same thing happens in neighborhoods. One person may be having a party on a Friday night that goes longer than their neighbor cares to enjoy, and consequently they will call the police department, who will deal with both neighbors and determine whether or not it's reasonable and try to get it back to a reasonable level. Those are judgment calls, and that's the way the ordinance is structured today. There are a somewhat more objective component on mufflers, and that is that they can't be modified in certain ways, but there's also a reasonableness standard applied to mufflers, and that would be specific vehicle implementation, which of course requires somebody to be there when the vehicle is being used in a way that exceeds what's reasonable. There are also some exemption provisions in the ordinance which proved to be pretty effective and not to generate much consternation. A good example of this might be paving Wadsworth Boulevard. To pave that during the daytime would be incredibly difficult for the contractor, but even more difficult for the traveling public. So we often provide exemptions for nighttime construction work. There are consideration of what the land uses are in the area. There's notification requirements ahead of time so people know it's going to happen, which, by the way, is usually the most effective way to keep complaints down, is because people understand these things once they know they're going to happen. So we try to do that kind of thing ahead. And, of course, you see those in the Friday, I think it's in the Friday reports that we report when those exemptions are provided. And they're all temporary, with the exception of snow plowing, where we have a permanent exemption for our own staff to plow snow on the streets in the middle of the night. This discussion tonight will follow this kind of an outline. You'll hear from Mr. Surgeon about some noise basics, how humans interact with noise, how humans hear noise, what the effects are, how they're measured. And then we'll talk a little bit about noise complaints in Lakewood. We'll mostly focus on the complaints that have come in through the Lakewood request system because they're documented. We can recreate that data. Clearly, we get complaints in other ways as well. Phone calls may come in or other kinds of things, but that's a good documented way, at least to give some scale to the number and types of complaints that we get. You'll see that for a 4-year period, so it's a fairly sizable data sample. We'll give some examples of noise criteria that can be used. We'll talk a little bit about noise barriers, and this is noise attenuation that's associated with major roadways. You can see some noise barriers along parts of 6th Avenue, particularly west of Sheridan, but there are other areas that can be considered. With the Wadsworth and 6th Avenue project, there will be noise barriers installed, and Mr. Surgeon, working for a different entity, was the consultant that designed those, and he'll talk about that a little more extensively. He will also look at the Rooney Valley and talk about the effects of Alameda on the neighboring properties, because that's an arterial street that has had more traffic growth than most of the arterial streets in recent years. And so that'll be an example that he runs through as well. Not in the same level of detail, but I think enough to provide some basic information and better understanding of the value, the costs, and the factors associated with noise barriers along major roadways. With that, I will conclude my introductory comments, and I'll come back up after Mr. Surgeon speaks. But he is a senior acoustical consultant with Hankard Environmental. He's done noise studies throughout Colorado. He's worked for private entities. He's worked for public entities. He's worked on major transportation projects. He's done professional witness work in the courts. So his experience is very broad, and I think it's been very effective as we've worked through this, and hopefully you'll find that to be the case as well. Mr. Surgeon?
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. This should be exciting.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Council. Jeff Surgeon, Hankard Environmental. We're going to start with noise basics. This first one is kind of the all I want you to get out of this is sound pressure is just, it's force per unit area. And it's also, it's logarithmic. So it adds up a little bit different, subtracts out a little bit different. So that's all you need to know from this. That's, if you want to go back to that, there you go. So what that math gets you is, if you have two sources and you add them together and they're both 80 decibels, you only go up by 3 decibels. You're not going to go up to 160. It's kind of same kind of thing. If you add up 3 the same, it only goes to 85. You add up 4 the same thing, goes to 86. So you can kind of see where I'm going with that. And another interesting part about noise is that 3 decibel change. So through testing and studies and all that sort of thing, everybody's come to the agreement that a 3 decibel change is just perceptible by humans. That's what we can pick out. 5 decibel change is readily perceptible, and a 10 decibel change is going to be perceived as doubling or halving, depending which way you're going. And another kind of useful fact on this for traffic, so everybody, you talk about a project and you say, so you do a traffic study, and then the concern is about noise increasing due to the traffic increase over a 30-year period. A lot of times we'll see that traffic go up 10%, 20%, 30%. To get that 3 decibel change, you're looking at doubling the traffic. So that's what we require. So that's how the kind of sensitivity of noise. And then this kind of gives you an idea of sound levels. I'm sure you've seen a bunch of these before in the past. But one thing to take note on these is that a couple things. One is every time you look at a sound pressure level, you also want to get a distance as well, because that's important. And then also you'll see this is in dBA, A-weighted. I'll talk about that in a second. And then also kind of shown here as well is kind of some of the more popular or well-known limits. So for CDOT, they do an hourly 66 dBA for traffic noise to consider a noise barrier. For a lot of cities and counties and states, they'll look at a more common daytime limit of 55 dBA and a common nighttime limit of 50 dBA, and that's more instantaneous. So that would be more, that would occur right away. It's not an hourly average or anything like that. And then if you look at the World Health Organization, they have this ultimate nighttime goal, outside goal of 40 dBA, and they say that if you have that, that means that your sleep's going to be good, you're not going to have heart problems. That's what they've come to with all their studies. So like I talked about before was, what is A-weighted sound? So a lot of times you'll see on TV, they'll show, I think they showed yesterday on like some basketball games, look, we're at like 110 decibels. Well, it's flat. That's not 110 dBA. There's no way. And so what the dBA weight part of it does for you is it's more relates to what you hear and how you react to sound. So humans are less upset about low frequency sound. I know thumping subwoofers is one thing, that's a little different, but you are more sensitive to the higher frequency sounds. So that is how, if you look at looking at this, if I told you something was 80 dBA flat, well, it could be more like 70 dBA AA weighted. So whenever you look at a noise level, and environmental noise is almost always dBA, you want to make sure you understand how it's weighted. And then we go and look at some noise complaints in Lakewood. These are the complaints that were just logged from 2014, 2017 through the internet. So this does not include the police department complaints. They have a separate. So you can kind of see how animals is a big one, and then a lot of residential, music and or general, and then of course vehicles and all that sort of thing. So we logged all that, and then you see pickleball down there at the bottom. We went ahead and merged online and police complaints and just kind of did like a little GIS heat map to kind of get an idea of where the complaints are coming from. And there are some hot spots. I don't know who's where, but
Sharon's house.
And then here you can see I'm kind of missing a few, and I left my gaps in there to kind of show you that I tried to get more information from some municipalities, but it was either they didn't know where to get the information, or they sent me back and forth to different ones, or they wouldn't get back to me, and I called, and eventually I kind of had to let it go. But you can kind of see where Lakewood is. You're right around 1%. And Lakewood kind of has this hybrid ordinance where you guys have like the no bells or chimes from certain times and that sort of thing. And you look at someone like Loveland, who has a pretty well defined ordinance and also a way to enforce it. They have a little bit lower. Now, with all that said, who knows for sure where all these numbers came from? I mean, you guys have this online system and the police department system. Sometimes they told me it was a police department. Sometimes they told me it was online. I don't know exactly what I was getting. So take these with a grain of salt. But it kind of does show that you guys aren't, there's no big outliers here. That's kind of what to take from that. Some examples. I kind of focused on traffic noise examples because that seemed to be kind of a driver. If I went into all the other examples, we'd be here a long time. So for tonight, we kind of focus on the traffic noise example. Noise criteria examples. I'm sorry, I'm not there yet. So looking at some common, and these are outdoor residential noise level thresholds. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, says 55 dBA is what they like for outside. State of Colorado is 55 dBA day and 50 dBA at night, and you'll see that all over the country. CDOT does 66 dBA, that's the loudest hour from traffic only. Not just go out there and a car drives by and you say it's over 66, I need a wall. And then HUD does, and it says 24-hour average, but it's actually, I believe it's a 24-hour LDN or a day-night average where you penalize 10 decibels at night. So that's another long average. And then the World Health Organization I mentioned before is 40, but again, that's a nighttime and that's over a whole year. So, and there's a lot of measuring. And then what you'll see in some other ones they'll do is they'll say, you can increase the limit by 3 to your project, the ambient level or the existing level, or you can increase the existing level by 5 or even sometimes 10 before you see an impact. And now I'm getting to the traffic noise examples I was talking about. We're going to go through 2 of them. It's very brief. The first one being US 6, which you guys are all very familiar with. The study area is east of Garrison. It's highlighted there. This is the kind of typical wall you'll see along that kind of highway. Up to 20 foot is what CDOT does. They won't go any taller. They'll consider anything over 20 foot to be infeasible. This is what we have to do. So if the city of Lakewood was to require a developer or something to do this is going to require them now to go out and hire a traffic noise person to do this traffic noise model, which is a federal highway model. We're at version 2.5 right now. It's going to go to version 2. Or version 3 soon. And these are required for every federal project or every state-funded project. We have to do them, or they have to do them. What you're looking at, if you see all the dots, those are going to be receptors or residences representing a house. All the black lines will be traffic or roads. And then all the red are going to be barriers, whether they're existing or proposed future ones. So we'll do this model. We'll put in traffic volumes. We'll put in future traffic volumes in 30 years. We'll come up with noise levels. And you'll see, just kind of looking at this real quick, you'll see with no walls, we're hitting 72, 68. Those are over 66 for CDOT. That's going to trigger a noise analysis. Not necessarily going to get a noise wall, but that will trigger a noise analysis. On the southwest quadrant, you'll see 72, 67. Again, that triggers. All it takes is one, and that triggers a noise analysis for the whole neighborhood. We then go ahead and model the walls and build them up to certain heights. In this case, we went to 15 feet, I believe, here. And you can see we're getting 8 decibels reduction, 7, 6. Down below, you're seeing 9, 7, 6. A goal is usually 10. 9 and 8 and 7 are really good. CDOT now, in their most recent revision, they're going to require at least a 7 decibel reduction at one impacted receptor. So they have limits to what you can do to get a noise wall. It's not just hit 66 to get a wall. Because CDOT does have their feasibility and reasonableness assessment. I'm not going to go into this in very much depth, but I will say that feasibility, when you first look at something, before you even look at the reasonableness, you want to see if you're even getting 5 dBA of noise reduction. And then are there any safety or maintenance issues, like are you shading the road and there's going to be ice all over the road? Can it physically be constructed? Or you got issues, water table, who knows? And if that all looks good, you move on to reasonableness, and then you really got to see if you can get 7, if that's possible, at one of the impacted receptors. And then there's this whole cost-benefit equation where we factor in how many people are benefiting, how much noise reduction is being achieved, and then what's that going to cost using a unit cost that CDOT has. It's not necessarily what it's really going to cost, but it's just more of a value that they came up with to judge all these walls. So in conclusion on this one, we ended up with 15-foot tall walls, Wadsworth to Garrison, north and south sides of US 6. We did a 15-foot tall wall on the eastbound ramp onto US 6, and then we varied some 8-foot to 15-foot tall walls. And those were all approved, all cost benefit, everything looked good, and they're in the project, so they will happen. And as soon as that happens in that kind of a project, they are agreed to, they have to happen at that point. So now looking more local, looking at Alameda noise analysis, I know you guys had a conversation last year about this exact spot, so we figured we'd pick it and do a sample analysis to kind of show you where that's going to get you. So for Forsberg Park, there were some people discussing or thought it'd be a good idea to possibly build a berm or a wall or something to enhance the park and maybe protect the residents. We didn't, not quite sure. So we did an analysis on it. I went ahead and I put in some artificial kind of future traffic volumes, and then did some predictions. Oh, I'm sorry. Here's a typical noise berm. You could put a shorter wall on top of that or something like that. This is out of Wikipedia. But here's a prediction for some future traffic volumes. This is loudest hour generally. So we're looking at, we have one spot up close that's hitting the CDOT 66, and then the rest of them are well below. You see the neighborhoods are 50s, low 50s. Again, this is going to be loudest hour. This is not just when one car, loud truck, or Harley goes by. So then what we did is I went ahead and built up a couple berms. Here's a couple potential berms, 8 foot tall. Let's see what happens. So you can see in the residence, we really don't get anything, and that's not surprising at all. That's typical that far away. You can see up close we get a better reduction, and you can kind of see in the middle we get a little bit less reduction. That's because of that gap. We decided to go a little bit taller and go up to 13 feet tall. You can finally see we hit one of those 7 decibel noise reduction numbers that CDOT likes to see. But we don't see a whole lot of benefit there. We still see in those 2s and 3s where it's just perceptible, and further back, we're not really seeing any benefit. That's because all the noise that's reaching those places that far back, the noise is already going up and over. So anything you build in front of the road, it's really not going to affect it. And then we go a little bit taller to 20 foot, and you can see we're getting a 10 decibel reduction up close. And then where that gap is, we're only hitting 6. You got a couple 6s in there, but overall, you look at this. You know, if CDOT looked at this, they'd be like, "That's not going to cut it for their reasonableness." I did not actually go in and do that calculation, but just looking at it, I'm pretty sure. And so that's where we kind of end up. That's with a 20-foot tall barrier. Now, this is a really complicated, busy slide, but I kind of just wanted to show if you kind of look at like the CDOT reduction requirement and kind of see that, look, we're only getting, you know, one location in the park is really even hitting it. To see just that 5 decibel, that readily perceptible change in noise, we're getting, you know, maybe 3 locations, and that's with a 20-foot barrier. 13-foot barely, you know, hits 2 of those. So it's tough for a non-dense park like that to achieve reasonable noise reduction if you're going to factor in all the little spots you might be hanging out in a park. Where they work well, again, like as you saw, US 6, where you have denser housing and people are a lot closer together. So, in conclusion, there, you know, there's really no perceptible benefit in any of the residential areas. 13 and 20-foot tall barriers are pretty much all that you're really seeing any kind of significant reduction in the park. And then you look at a berm footprint, because usually you have to maintain these berms. You want to mow them, and so you got to have you can have only so much slope to them. So you get a very large footprint for a 20-foot tall at 100 feet wide. So then going kind of back to the noise ordinances. You know, there's the subjective noise ordinance where it pretty much just says in there, don't be unreasonable. Leave it to the police officers to make their judgment call. Leave it to planning staff if they think that HVAC unit's going to be loud. You know, this whatever is reasonable. Then you get to the objective ordinances, where you have the more the numeric limitations, the 50, 55 dB at night, and then now you have to enforce that. Now you're pulling out noise meters, or you're having a noise consultant come in and tell you that a development's not going to exceed any of those with any of their equipment or their planned uses. And then you kind of have the hybrid ordinance, where you kind of pick and choose what you want to put in there and make sure it doesn't conflict itself. So the hybrid noise ordinance, I guess for Lakewood, is we're calling it, I guess, a hybrid. That's kind of what we ended up with. No real numeric volume limitations. You have all these limits, and these are great because it's, again, easy to enforce. Doesn't take anybody with a meter and a whole lot of knowledge and noise to deal with it. And then you have the subjective components, which keep the just leave it again to the police officers to make the decisions. And then, as we saw before, the temporary and the so you can do the nighttime construction, that sort of thing. Whereas one example I can kind of give you with the exemptions, I actually did do one for, I've done a couple actually for where it was on one side was Lakewood, other side was Denver. Denver has a very complex way to get a nighttime noise ordinance. It used to include measurements. We finally got them to drop the measurements, the ambient noise measurements, the existing measurements. It requires an analysis. It requires notification. It requires hotel vouchers. It requires measurement to come out and take measurements during the night. It requires submitting reports each week. And it also requires going before the Board of Environmental Health and getting approval for such a nighttime noise variance. So whereas Lakewood, it was writing a letter to the city and explaining what you're doing and then letting them know, and that's it. So it was a lot easier process, a lot less cost. This is an example of the city of Loveland. I've done a bit of work in there. For their ordinance, the traffic noise is exempt. Some other ordinances, they may include traffic ordinance or may include the traffic in the ordinance. But this is a typical one. It works pretty well. They do have staff that will go out and measure. They do have requirements to submit a noise study with a planned development to ensure that you're not going to exceed. So if with Lakewood considering this, you'd have to consider how you're going to enforce it, who's going to do it. You have to train the people how to do it. You'd have to also get the proper noise measurement equipment, and then figure out how you're going to prosecute, what kind of fees, fines you're going to put on it. and then all the exemptions and grandfathering and variances that you might want to include. And then with that, back to Jay.
Thank you.
I want to talk just a little bit about our request to you, and that is to seek some guidance on whether or not you want to move forward with additional discussion regarding the noise ordinance, and if so, what components. And I've listed 3 items here that might be topics for a future study session if you choose, only because those are the ones that we've heard more about. You saw the long list of different types of noise complaints. Most of those we haven't heard much about. So I narrowed it down to 3 that seem to be of greater interest. And I'll walk through each of those individually. The first one is individual vehicle noise. You may remember loud motorcycles as the example in different areas of town. 13% of the complaints over those 4 years. That translates to a total number of complaints of about 10 per year. One of the challenges, of course, with this is that you have to be there when it happens, and that's very difficult to do. Currently, it's an unreasonableness standard or reasonableness standard, plus the limitation on modifications to the muffler system. A numeric standard of some sort, a decibel standard for any kind of noise being added to the noise ordinance would require the kinds of things that Mr. Surgeon mentioned. We'd have to have the equipment, we'd have to train the people, we'd have to have the people who are trained with the equipment available when the noises are happening. It's a little more complex than using a reasonableness standard. But it's possible, as you saw in the Loveland ordinance example. So that's one that perhaps you want to consider because you've heard more of those kinds of complaints than some of the others. The second one is the arterial road noise, and this is the constant noise. This isn't a single vehicle kind of a thing. It's the kind of situation that Mr. Surgeon mentioned where to get the 3 decibel increase, which is what's necessary for it to be perceptible, you have to double the traffic volume. It's about 2% of the complaints, which translates to about 2 per year on the Lakewood request system. And one of the key features of this is it's essentially a retrofit program. Lakewood doesn't have many new arterial streets yet to be built. There's a little bit in the Rooney Valley, but not much. Most of that's even built at this point. So this would probably be publicly funded projects. If you began to think about which roads are the loudest, you could probably start with 6th Avenue and then look at 285 and Wadsworth and Kipling and parts of Alameda and other roads as well. But for this discussion, I just talked about arterial streets, the higher volume roadways. They're probably the ones that might draw the most attention. I use 99% as being the percentage that's already built out of all the arterial roadways that will ever be in Lakewood. It may be a little bit higher than that, but I couldn't say 100, because it's not quite done. There's probably 28 to 30 miles of arterial streets that are next to residential properties. Of course, many arterial streets have commercial properties along them where putting up walls would be counterproductive and not desired by the adjacent owner anyway for visibility purposes. The existing homes adjacent to arterials, probably 28 to 30 miles. Those homes vary from just 25 feet from the roadway to as much as, well, you saw in the Rooney Valley, hundreds of feet from the roadway. They also have another issue. If this doorway over here was open right now and somebody was doing something on the other side and it became distracting, somebody would probably get up and shut the door because it reduces the noise. On arterial streets, you have crossing streets, you have driveways. All of those things essentially create a permanent opening in the wall. And as Mr. Surgeon talked about, that one location in the park in the Rooney Valley has an opening, and so the decibel level is higher because more noise can come through there. When you begin to think about all the arterial streets in all of Lakewood, many of those have many gaps, and so it would be a process of looking to identify which locations might make the most sense. There's some wall cost information here on the bottom of the slide, and it's kind of open-ended, partly because the aesthetics of the wall translate to money. On the very low end, basic, flat, no-color wall, maybe $30 a square foot, so 1 square foot of the face of the wall. So if it's a 15-foot high wall, then it's $450 to make 1 lineal foot of the wall construction. So those numbers translate to something like $80 to $100 million if the full 30 miles were constructed. It's a big number, And doing even less, while it would still be less expensive than $100 million, it's still going to be substantial. So some of the factors that are worth considering here is the problem. How big is the problem? How frequent is the problem? How much do people expect the problem? How much is it going to grow? But also the effectiveness of the walls. This is where the gaps that would be necessary come into play. These are also a dividing device in a community. What about the appearance? How does it make you feel driving down the road? How does it make you feel if you're in the neighborhood with these walls along the side of your neighborhood? Now, if it's 6th Avenue, it may be well worth it. If it's part of Kipling, where the homes are set back further, perhaps the dividing wall isn't as beneficial from an aesthetic standpoint. The variation in appearance I mentioned can change the costs. And in addition to the initial cost, there's always some maintenance cost. Most of that maintenance cost, depending on the material used, is probably dealing with graffiti for decades. And no other costs is what I mean. Not that the graffiti would come up routinely, but it will come up occasionally. But concrete walls tend to not need much maintenance other than that kind of surface maintenance. So a lot of things that could be considered if this is an area of further interest. Mr. Surgeon mentioned that out in the Rooney Valley it took a 20-foot tall wall to have much effect in the park, and even that didn't have enough effect in the residential area to matter. And just to put that in perspective, from where you're sitting, from where your feet are, to the ceiling directly above you is half that height. So that's 10 feet. So a 20-foot wall would be twice that distance. It's pretty substantial. Let me go on to the third situation that I suggested might be worth discussing, and that's sports activity noise. This comes in a lot of different versions. It's an inherent aspect of community recreation that's outdoors, and a lot of our recreation facilities are outdoors. There's ballparks, there's ball fields, there's play fields, there's all kinds of things, playgrounds for the younger kids. And some of those are in residential areas because they serve residential people. People from their homes can walk to the recreational facility. So there's a reason for that, but they do make some noise. Pickleball was one of the examples that we used. One location where there's a complaint, I think it may be limited to one individual near that one location, but I can't say that with certainty. But there's not a standard related to outdoor recreation noise, and yet it's something we hear about occasionally. So with the concluding slide, I just want to offer 5 different alternatives for whatever guidance you give us tonight, and I'm sure there are others. That's why the 5th one is other. The first one is none. And if I were to make a recommendation, I guess if I talk like that, I am actually, aren't I? I would give some serious thought to none. We do have noise problems. We do have noise complaints. The solutions aren't easy to the noise complaints that are more common, like the arterial roadway noise. We'll make some progress with the Wadsworth and 6th Avenue interchange because those walls that Mr. Surgeon talked about in that location are a requirement of that construction project. It just hasn't been built yet. So that's one option. The individual vehicle noise I mentioned, the arterial roadway noise we talked about, sports activities we talked about, and any other individual circumstance or combination could also be a discussion point as well. So I'm leaving this very broad because we're here to look for some guidance on where to go next, which will probably necessitate another study session geared more deeply and specifically to any particular area that you might be interested in. With that, the presentation concludes.
Great. Well done. Thank you. And Mr. Surgeon, you might there might be some questions for you. In fact, I think my first one start with you. And that has to do with technology and the use of technology to offset. And I had heard years ago that CDOT was looking at alternatives to sound walls to actually trying to find noise calming devices or different materials. So my question is, how far are they along on that? And then the second part is on like traffic on like a 6th Avenue. Is it the tires on the road? Is it the engine? Is it the exhaust? What's creating the most noise?
Okay. As far as technology goes, we actually did do a study for CDOT over several years, measuring different concretes, different tining, different asphalts. Actually, one of the big studies was in Colorado Springs. They were using different open-graded asphalts, that sort of thing. So we went down and did a number of measurements, and they would put down, we'd measure before with the bad asphalt. We'd measure with the brand new open-graded asphalt. We'd get a reduction. Then we come back a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, about 3 years later, all the reduction goes away. Other things with noise walls is going to be like the sound absorbing materials that they'll put on the inside. Sometimes they have to do that, but it is very expensive. And all I see going up nowadays, even with CDOT, is straight slab concrete walls. So there is no new technology that's fixing this.
Okay. No. Thank you.
And then you had another question about, the noise sources. And noise sources, it's tire road interactions, probably number one, depending on the vehicle, then engine, then exhaust. It all kind of depends. It's all three of those, though. So it's not just one or the other. But the tire road is the primary.
Okay. Great. Mr. Abel. And if you want to, you can grab a seat here if you don't.
My first question would probably be for Mr. Cox. There was part of the slide that said if you tie a violation to a decibel reading that you're going to have trained officers and devices. It also would seem to me, would it seem to you, let me put it in the form of a question, would it seem to you that going to court and saying, well, this noise is unreasonable, and the plaintiff's attorney says define unreasonable, you might have would it be your opinion, you might have a harder time pressing the case than if you had an actual decibel reading that is less subjective?
Yeah, that's certainly the biggest drawback of a subjective standard is eye the beholder, or ear the beholder, I guess. But it is true with light in a similar fashion. But words like that are used in statutes that we enforce: reasonableness, significant, substantial. Words like that sometimes have to be available to cover these situations. I think, and Mr. Surgeon could certainly say this better than I could, but I think on the objective side, you need the training, you need the equipment, you need to stay current on that equipment, you need to use it right, and you need to have some locational requirements so that you can determine the sound and the decibel level from a particular point on the ground, and it's going to be quite different from somebody else's perspective. So I think that's where the subjective standards come into play. Is that reasonable?
I agree with that, yeah.
And for our expert, there are devices that are fairly easy to read, or they're not, that measure decibel levels.
There are devices that are easy to read for sure. One of the issues you're going to run into, though, is that somebody will go out and use it, and if they have the improper windscreen on it, they're going to read a high level. If they don't have a windscreen on it, they're going to read a high level. If they have the setting down on dB instead of dBA, they're going to read a high level. And then also sometimes they'll get an instantaneous level where it'll just spike for half a second, and they'll be like, oh, look, went over. So sometimes you need a little more technical equipment that's going to actually log that level and average that level and give you more of an average level. It all kind of comes, and a lot of ordinances don't even specify that, though. Some of them will say 1 hour, some will say 1 minute, some will say.
I'm familiar with some ordinances that set a decibel level and the location being the edge of a property. It would seem to me, even if you have a somewhat variable accuracy rate or a margin of error for the device, that it would be a lot easier to prove than, say, well, I noticed one of your examples of a high level of complaints was Wheat Ridge. Wheat Ridge, the last I heard, their ordinance said if there's a complaint, then that's evidence that that the noise level was too high. Wouldn't that be kind of a difficult stretch to prosecute?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I was actually just at a Board of Environmental Health in Denver hearing, and they actually had a thing coming the other way where they went and measured someone applied for a noise variance request, They got the noise variance. They had their concert. The hearing officer went out and took measurements. They were over the limit. They were over limit a few times, and then they got cited. They fought it. They won. They did not have to pay a fine, and then the Board of Health came back and said, no, nobody has to complain. If they're over the limit, they're over the limit. So I've seen it both ways.
Okay. Thank you. I noticed that in some of our ordinances, governments are also held to a standard. Chimes, for instance, Belder chimes. There's a violation, and it applies to any church clock or school. We've been having some complaints from school sports fields. The number of complaints seem to have risen when they started using omnidirectional speakers. In a case like that, for instance, the Walmart down the street from me had a speaker out on the side of the building pointed straight down 4th Avenue, and you could hear at my house, which is 300 yards away or 200 yards away, you could hear it better than you could on site. So would it be feasible to require directional speakers that could be kind of direct the sound away from adjacent neighborhoods? Would that be possible?
Yeah, that's pretty common. Again, that will fall toward not having an objective ordinance, though, because like in somewhere like Loveland, where we actually went and specified that they will have to, they have to meet the limit at the property line. So instead of using one large speaker, you use a bunch of smaller speakers, and they're directional, and that way you're getting the noise where it needs to be, and you're not having to pump as much power through those speakers. So it's totally doable. They just didn't have any requirement to do that. I'd look at the planning staff. That would be something they would have to catch, I think, to let you guys know that that's a thing.
I believe, Mr. Cox, my reference to the government thing, a school, I believe that it's your opinion, is it not, that we could include governments in the noise ordinance if we had a decibel level at property line or any other regulation?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to comment on that just because I haven't looked at that specifically. We've talked in other contexts about the applicability of our laws to other government entities, but I haven't looked at that specifically as would apply to noise, but we certainly can.
Okay, we certainly can include
we
governments?
certainly can look into it further.
Well, we do already have this that says schools can have loud chimes between certain hours.
Right.
So if we can include them there, it seems like we could include them in other governments elsewhere.
I presume that to be valid, but I'm just saying I can't explain why we would have why there'd be a difference in applicability between different kinds of regulations.
Okay. And Mr. Surgeon, we now have a 300-foot limit for garbage trucks between the hours of 7 and 10, or 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. I continue to get complaints from neighbors whose children are awakened well before school time by the backup signal on a garbage truck, or having trucks being unloaded and leaving their pulling away from the trailer and making a lot of noise. Is 300 feet standard, or could we expand that?
I'm not sure where the 300 feet comes from. We could always look into it. There will be a typical sound power level for a trash truck, but some of those banging and clanging are tough. One thing, though, that it was actually brought up about technology. There are better backup alarms out there that are they're not tonal. They're broadband. They're also ambient controlled, so that if a truck behind a dump or a trash truck, it may not be the the signal that must be emitted is generally 10 to 15 decibels louder than the ambient condition. That's an alarm for you. And if the level is only 60 decibels behind that trash truck, it's only going to be up to 70, 75 versus a constant 107 dBA pumping out every time for no reason. So they're not very expensive. It just hasn't been implemented in the United States a lot. It's coming. I mean, I recommend them almost for every construction project that I work on, just because they aren't that expensive and they cut down on complaints. I mean, I personally do have a bus that backs up somewhere near my house every single, I don't know where it is, and it's that tonal alarm wakes me up every morning. So I know what you're talking about.
And speaking of loudness, there are a few things as loud as an irate mother who's calling her council person because their kids were awakened at 4 a.m. Are those things, that equipment, are they inexpensive enough that we could require their use, or would it require a large expenditure on the part of, say, a garbage fleet to change those things out?
I think they cost about $130 each-ish.
Really?
Easy to install.
Okay. I think that takes care of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. For those at home that might be curious, we have a little change of seating, and what we're going to do is we're just going to, because this is study session, because it is recorded, those who are not in the building at the particular moment can still be able to go ahead and listen. We're not making any decisions tonight other than coming to consensus. So what we're going to do is we're just going to keep rocking and rolling if this is an important topic, and I think we need to go with it. So guess who got to speak next? That's me. So what we're going to do is my questions were to Chief McCaskey. Chief, what I wanted to ask is, in Ward 5, some of our noise complaints that we get all the time are lots of vehicles racing on Kipling and on Jewel and on Hamden. And I know we've got some new police coming on board. Will they be able to be doing more nighttime patrols to catch those folks?
That's a good question. It's all a matter of priorities, I guess. I know that noise is an issue, but I think we constantly battle what people think are priorities. And if it's a quiet night, then obviously we can do that.
Okay.
But if there's other calls for service that are a higher priority, it makes it difficult. So.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. I'm going to ask a quick question. Does anybody in the audience have any Benadryl with them in their pocket? Okay, never mind. Okay, sorry. We're just off on the races here, another way of trying to take care of the mayor. So that helps a lot. Thank you very much. And I'm not sure who was next there, so I'm just going to guess. Do you know? Okay, Sharon, you're up next.
I would just like to offer for consideration that right now we put this on hold. I was going to recommend that right now the possibilities are none for future study sessions, with the caveat that we can come back to it. I think it's an important topic, but I know there's a lot of other things, and we've got a lot of study sessions coming. I think with one of the main concerns I get is the noise along 6th Avenue, which looks like it's going to be somewhat addressed when we get the CDOT issue in, which may take care of it. I have no doubt that we're going to have individual vehicle noise increases as the summer months come on with motorcycles. But at this time, I vote to put this on hold for right now.
Hey, remember, we're not voting, but we're taking consensus.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Can I just add? Just as this is my opinion only, I think reducing noise through enforcement activities is probably not a viable alternative. There's so many vehicles and there's only so many cops on the street, and I just think that if you think enforcement's the way out of it to solve this problem, I think we're all going to be disappointed. I just don't think we have enough resources. and I know motorcycle safety groups also will argue that loud pipes are a safety issue, and that's probably a group that's would have a really strong vocal opinion about enforcement of such things. So.
And that was part of my thing too, the enforceability and where are we using our resources. So I'd like to offer that for consideration.
Councilor LeBear?
Within this discussion, are we also talking about noise complaints, neighbor on neighbor? Is that also included in this?
In the chart that had different noise complaints, many of those must be related to neighbor on neighbor because it's noise from homes, barking dogs, those things were both in there.
So do we have a figure on, and it might have been in here, I think I missed it, but is there also just a number on sort of calls for complaints or calls for service like that?
Let me respond to that in a couple of ways. In the service request system, it's relatively limited. Residential music noise was 51 complaints over 4 years, so what's that, 12 or 13 a year? And it went down from there. General residential noise was a little bit less and on down. In the police department, from the data we got from the communications center, about a third of the complaints are in a general category called noise. So we don't have any more distinction on those. But music plus party is about half of the total. That's probably neighbor to neighbor.
Partially my fault. I apologize.
Which the party or the music?
Both. I guess. So what's the number figure on that every year? And did I miss that?
Police. Yeah, I don't have the total on the police. The people who don't use paper know. This is 4 years worth of data, and the total complaints through the communication center was about 8,700. So music, broken into the 4 categories: fireworks, music, noise, and party.
And when our officers go out to these complaints, do we ticket generally? Just curious.
I don't have an answer for you, Counselor. I mean, 8,700 complaints. I could maybe defer to the city attorney. She would know. I mean, we ticket some. A lot of times we get there, it's that reasonableness standard. I mean, people have different perceptions. A loud stereo at 3 a.m, we're probably going to ticket somebody. But a loud stereo at 1 p.m, more than likely not. So it just depends. And then a lot of times when we get there, if it's an anonymous RP reporting party, we get there, it's quiet. These calls aren't priority, so they're very low on the priority list. So a lot of times when we get there, the noise is already gone. But
I would agree. I'm Jenna Roth with the prosecution office. I would agree with what the chief said. I think it depends on the situation. A lot of times the police respond and they don't initially ticket. They just ask the person to turn the music down. If they then have to go back that same night, more likely a ticket is going to be issued at that time. But we do use the police officers too in the case, if it is ticketed, as to what they heard. Because we don't always have the neighbors to testify to the complaint. So it really does depend on the situation, but a lot of times a first response is not going to result in a ticket.
Thanks. And my other question was related to the technology. I know the mayor talked a little bit about it, but is there any tertiary policies you can implement that helps noise, like lowering speeds? More trees, I don't know, anything like that?
Yes, but I can't remember the exact number, but to really see an effect on noise for lowering speed, you're looking at reducing 10 miles an hour, pretty substantial. Trees, trees and brush and that sort of thing really don't work until you'll hear different thoughts on it, but you're looking at 100 meters depth of trees in all shapes and sizes, filled in to really see any kind of measurable difference. One thing you do get with trees though is out of sight, out of mind, so that kind of helps a little bit. But when you measure, you really aren't going to measure much of a difference. So there is. We also look at on CDOT projects. We'll look at even shifting the roadway. We'll look at trying to use ramps and things as barriers. So you try and be smart about it, but that's kind of where it's at.
Thanks. That's all I have.
Councilor Bida.
Thank you, Mayor. I know in our ward, I'm not hearing a lot of these complaints about noise. What I'm hearing are things like gunshots or loud motorcycles, those kind of things, and those are enforcement issues. I mean, I don't see that as something that we can, or need to address by legislation, at least at not this point. And some of these other, it's complicated. These sound like complicated issues. There's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of pieces, and I'm just not sure it warrants us using a lot of our resources right now on this thing, given the, one, it's not a high priority even in enforcement, and it seems like they're handling it. Sounds like they're handling it pretty well, and two, we've got a lot of, like one of my other co-counselors says, we've got a lot of other things that are important. And I'm not saying this isn't, but I'm not sure that some of these other things that are already in the pipeline aren't going to address a lot of the problems. So maybe it would make more sense to see how those shake out before we launch into, a lot of spending our resources on it at this point. But the idea being coming back and looking at it down the road a little bit farther when some of these other remedies are in place. That's my thought.
So if I might offer counsel, and there's still a couple people lit up, but we still have another important subject to discuss tonight. Maybe the option right now is just to look at better reporting. And it sounds like, when you look at the police, it's kind of a mix. We don't really know. And so we're only gathering one side of it. So maybe we take a look in a year with some better reporting or better understanding of what those actual sound complaints are looking like or where they're from. Maybe that's an option. And then we can come back to it. Councilor Gutwein.
I think that sounds good. I agree with what Councilor Bida said, and I think at this time it's not a priority.
Councilor Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Surgeon, I'm interested in your take on something. You said that technology actually isn't there. Not long ago, I was told about some type of a beam, if you will, for lack of better thought or term on my side, that when it's along the artery, along the road, the beam somehow can shine towards where the noise is, and I guess towards where the tires and the asphalt are, and has a way of neutralizing, if you will, the sound. Is there actually, have you heard of that, or is that?
There is a thing called active noise, and so we've used it in aircraft and small vessels, that sort of thing, where you can actually do that. Out in the open, in the free field, it doesn't work yet. It's not effective. So, but on aircraft, it does work for like calming tones on prop aircraft, on twin props, that sort of thing is pretty effective. On jets and small cabins, it works on that as well. But as far as like putting speakers on top of noise walls and shooting the noise away, that's not an option.
Thank you. And also, I'm not really sure how to even go about this, because I know that you don't all have this in your wards. But Charlie and I do get considerable feedback on the speakers at Lakewood High School. And during athletic events. If there's some way, somehow, we can take a look at dealing with that, since governmental entities are not under this and are opted out. I'm not sure how that works, but it'd be good to figure out a way where we can help, because there's so many issues in that area, and they're just mounting and creating more angst. Thank you.
Mr. Abel.
First, I'd like to agree with the chief. We don't have enough police officers for them to be out doing things like noise ordinance violations and parking tickets, for instance. We need more code enforcement officers to help relieve that. We'll talk about that toward budget time. And I agree that right now this is not the most pressing issue we're facing. If you're the person who's losing sleep because of these noises, it's very, very important. But in the grand scheme of what we have to look at over the next few months, I think this can take a back seat. So I would agree that maybe we put it off for a while.
So with that is our consensus that we just thank you for the great information, and we learned a lot about sound tonight, and we'll take this as a lesson learned.
And come back to it later?
Well, I guess, but I mean, I guess we need some clear direction if we want to come back to it later. Is this?
No, just eventually. Just keep it in the back of our mind.
Okay. All right.
On Ms. Hodgson's list with a check mark, minus.
You got it.
Thank you.
Check mark.
Thank you, Mr. Surgeon. Okay, Jay, you're up next. Again.
Thank you, Mayor. Council, again, Jay Hutchison, Director of Public Works. And this is a nearing culmination step, I think, in a discussion that's been underway for a while, as many of you know. I do want to cover some components of the information that you received in your packet, but I'm not going to try to cover everything that was in there. I'm not sure that that's necessary, but I'm happy to answer questions about any of that material. The foundation for this discussion is the effect of abandoned shopping carts in the community. Clearly, they're unsightly. They can interfere with pedestrian or bicycle traffic if they're on paths. Can promote blight. There's an expense to the business community and their customers, and we're trying to solve that kind of problem. The recommendation that you'll hear at the end of my presentation is a request that the council, through your consensus process, suggests that the ordinance come forward for final action and adoption. To get to that point, I'm going to talk a little bit about goals, some input that was obtained, and then just outline the ordinance fairly quickly, I think. Let me start with goals. Obviously, the primary goal, the only reason we're really here on this topic, is to get the carts picked up. And that, in my view, includes returning them to the appropriate owners so that isn't just a lost expense that then turns into an expense for the patrons as well. To get there and be able to do that, we need an easy reporting system. We need to make it as convenient as possible for people to tell us where they are as soon as they see those. So we tried to address that. And we want to minimize the public expense. That was a specific topic in August when the City Council discussed this topic. And it also is relevant because in today's environment with the constitutional provisions, any revenue generated by the program is not actually a net decrease in the cost because it's rebated because of Tabor. So all costs in this program to the city are net costs. None of those can be recovered through the fees that I'll talk about here in a minute. We do want to, or I believe we want to avoid any unnecessary expenses to the businesses and their patrons. And the circumstances vary dramatically between businesses that have shopping carts. Some may have as few as 5 at a particular location. Some have hundreds at a particular location. So their circumstances are very different. The costs that have been reported to us vary. Most of the carts seem to be in the $75 to $150 range a piece, but we've had reports up to $500. And the electric vehicles, which also sometimes leave the sites and have to be retrieved, are thousands of dollars. So there's a broad range. Most are probably in the more like $75 to $150 range. We do want to minimize, I think, the police burden for some of the same reasons that you just heard discussed about noise, and keeping in mind that the ability to identify the perpetrator, the person who stole the cart, is usually very limited. The carts are usually found literally abandoned, so it's difficult to identify the perpetrator. One of the discussions that we've had before is about the idea of reducing theft of the carts in the first place. That's something that the retailers are really focused on, and after more discussions with the retailers and the retail groups, I think they're probably in the best position to do that most effectively. I'll talk a little bit about a couple of ideas. Actually, I won't. In the memo, we talked a little bit about a couple of ideas that I'm not recommending, but we could come back to if you'd like. But the retailers take a pretty aggressive stance on trying to deal with their asset protection, and this is a key component of their asset protection. There's been a lot of input from City Council study sessions and other discussions from others in the community, including retailers, obviously, who are the cart owners, and then some cart retrievers. There are companies that is their business, or part of their business is to retrieve abandoned shopping carts. So with that, let me go to the actual proposed approach for the ordinance. And I'm going to talk about it in 3 parts, and I'm going to be a little redundant probably. This that I'm going to start with is kind of the default program. It is the default program. If nothing happened other than adoption of the current ordinance that's before you, this program is what would occur. Cart owners would have to register, and their registration would provide the information necessary to get the carts returned back to them. So we need to know, how do they have their carts marked? Where do they want these returned? Those kinds of things. Who do we call when they have to come pick them up? So that's the registration piece. It's a one-time thing unless something changes on behalf of the cart owners, but it's something that we do on the front end of the program. We'd beef up the Request Lakewood system to make it easy and obvious to report abandoned carts. With that would be a public information program to alert everybody that it's a reporting process on Request Lakewood. So we use all our different communication venues to encourage reporting and tell them how to do it, make it easy as possible and as well known as possible. Third, we would actually retrieve the abandoned carts. We'd hire a contractor whose job it would be to respond to those Request Lakewood items and any other information they receive, or an abandoned cart they happen to see while they're out collecting other carts, and pick those up. This is probably a place that I should take just a minute to define what the current draft ordinance means by an abandoned cart. It means a cart essentially that's empty but not on the premises where it's supposed to be. We've had a good deal of discussion, and I think you did as well at your last discussion, about what do you do with carts that have personal property in those. And there are significant issues associated with that, with due process, making sure that we don't throw away things that are invaluable to a person who owns them that happen to be in the cart. And so we want to avoid that problem. The second problem we want to avoid or minimize is the potential for some kind of a confrontation. We're going to hire a cart contractor who's going to be a guy with a truck, probably, and not somebody who has police training or other kinds of skills necessarily. And so we don't want to create confrontation. So we're primarily focused, in fact, the way this ordinance is designed, it's exclusively focused on empty carts that are truly off by themselves and abandoned. Those other things are real issues, but they seem to be outside of the scope of the major part of this program. The costs are going to be related to several things. One is hiring the cart contractor, paying the cart contractor to retrieve the carts, having a place to impound those, the administrative part of contacting the owners, having them come in, making sure they pick up the right carts, making sure they pay the bill, those kinds of things. There will be some administrative costs. There will also probably be some orphan carts. We have had a few that you can't identify who they belong to. That's what I mean by orphan carts. So we'll just have to dispose of those. We won't be reimbursed for any costs associated with those. And again, the reimbursement is not a net value anyway. One of the key components that the cart owners brought up was that they're concerned about a program that could provide an incentive for a cart contractor or retrieval contractor to retrieve carts out of the owner's parking lot and then return them and get paid for retrieving not stolen yet carts. So that's a challenge, and it's going to take some administrative work to address that, and probably there's not a perfect answer to that. So it's a simple, direct approach. We have a contact system. We get it well publicized. It's an easy thing to do. We have a contractor whose job it is to follow up on that. The requests would come to a city employee and the contractor directly, so there's not another step in the communication to send the contractor out. And then there'd be reimbursement by the cart owners. We'd have to have an impoundment area. That's the basic program. The ordinance includes 2 options. And I want to emphasize that these are not options, meaning we could do a different kind of ordinance to have this kind of option. These 2 options that I'm going to talk about are in the draft ordinance that you have before you. But they don't come into effect until a cart owner chooses to make them operable. So this is the first option. At a cart owner's choice, they could have an agreement with the cart contractor, the city's cart retrieval contractor, to deliver the carts directly to the cart owner, with the cart owner directly paying the contractor. It does a couple of things. Gets us out of the middle of impounding and managing carts, which I like. It also gets us out of the cost, some of the costs, the retrieval costs that are attributable to that cart owner's carts. So there's some savings for the cart owner, which should provide some financial incentive for the cart owner to ask to implement this approach. And it's likely, although I'm not prepared to say it's certain, that the cart contractor, the retrieval contractor, would actually be paid more in total if they had a lot of cart owners asking that the retrieval contractor return the carts to that particular owner. So there's 2 incentives on both sides financially that would suggest this might work really well and get the city almost out of the business of cart retrieval. The second option, again, this is in the ordinance. It's not an optional ordinance. It's a part of this ordinance. Is a proposal that's a little broader, and it's a little less well defined. This would be an entirely alternative program. So a cart owner or a consortium of cart owners could say, I understand the city's ordinance, but I want to do it a whole different way. And we have an example of that I'll talk about here in a minute. But that would allow the city to evaluate their proposed program and say, that's comparable or better than what we would do, so go for it. If it fails, we'll come back to the default program. That won't go away because it will have been adopted with the ordinance. So in summary, the key here is that we want to reduce the asset loss if we can and reduce the community costs. And I don't just mean dollar costs here, but the blight and the other kinds of costs that abandoned carts cause. We want to make sure they get retrieved. That's why the default program is focused on just go get them. And then we want to eventually get them back to the owners. Any of these kinds of programs would do that, any of the options. And then we do have options specifically there to decrease the financial obligation of the community and to make the administration as efficient as possible. The recommendation, as I said, is for City Council consensus to bring the ordinance forward for adoption. Now a footnote, as you received by email, the Colorado Retail Council has made a proposal that essentially would fit under the second option. They have proposed to do their own cart collection program that would deal with carts around the city. It's not completely fleshed out. We haven't tried to ask all the questions that we should probably ask, but apparently there's interest in at least one alternative to the default program, which I was thrilled to see, frankly. I think it may offer an opportunity to do things a little more efficiently, but it's not been fully vetted. We wouldn't do that until we actually have an ordinance to compare it against. So I just wanted to give you a heads up that that is certainly a possibility. And with that, I think I'll end the presentation and we can go further. Right. Mayor?
Well, thank you very much. Jay, you've done a lot of background on this. I think, there's very few comparables throughout the community, throughout the nation that have ordinances. And when we looked at a couple templates, I think you've exceeded a lot of that. And I think in the early days when Councilor Johnson and I met with the Retail Council, this is really what your intention was was to get them to take ownership. So to be really short, I look forward to seeing this come forward to first reading with all the recommendations. But secondly, I think this council, and maybe there's some creative ways, we talked about this at the study session. Some people utilize these carts to get their groceries to public transportation. And whether that's a single cart that is part of the grocery store, or we talked about something that is artistic, or a loan program, I think that's important because we do have that need in our community. So, Ms. Johnson.
Thank you, Mayor. Oh my goodness. Jay, I am just so pleased what you've done here. And I really want to thank you. You've done a lot of research. You've done a lot of outreach to the retailers. It is not punitive. It was never intended to be punitive. And I just can't tell you how grateful I am that we are finally addressing this issue. Our previous council had dealt with this in a study session. We had a motion forward to actually go forward, and somehow that didn't happen. And I would just like to say on a personal note, this is much better than what we had come up with. However, if it looks like council, we're humans, and if it looks like we've got something that probably isn't the best that we could come up with, please just, as a professional courtesy, tell us it needs more time and more research rather than just kind of ignoring what was on the table. But I can't tell you how happy I am for tonight. I appreciate the way the ordinance is written. And as the mayor said, we did sit down with the retailers, with Chris Hawes, is it? Chris Hawes. And also a representative from Safeway. That's been a couple years, and frankly, they weren't ready at that time to be an honest partner here. But now they are. It's awesome. The only thing that maybe I think that we could consider on this ordinance is somehow the carts need to have, you're talking about orphan carts, and just have the retailers put some kind of a tag on it with their name, and maybe put the request Lakewood on there so folks know if they see it what to do, or give them a phone number and they can directly contact that contractor, and maybe bypass the system if they see that on there. But thank you. I am so grateful for tonight. Thank you, thank you.
Thanks for your comments, and there were a lot of people involved in this. It certainly wasn't just me, but including Mr. Cox and maybe others that are in the room. I can't remember who's in the room anymore. You know, we did talk a lot about how, or not a lot, but we thought through how best to identify who owns the cart and how to get it back to the owner. And one option clearly is to tag every cart with something that includes the Request Lakewood connection and a phone number and those kinds of things. We looked at it from a couple of perspectives, and the conclusion we reached was maybe at this stage that's not necessary. Maybe we'll find that it is at some point. One is that the reporting parties, the general public, are probably not inclined to get out and go up to a cart and get that much detailed information and then have to input it into the computer system. And we can retrieve the cart, on the retrieval part, we can retrieve the cart by only knowing the geographic location. We don't need anything else at that point. Now later, when we need to get them returned to the owner, we do need to know who owns those. As we looked at that facet, it became clear that I can't say all, but we haven't found an example where a retailer's cart doesn't have some kind of corporate identification on it. That doesn't give us enough information to return it to the right grocery store, if it's a King Soopers cart, as an example. But it gives us enough to call King Soopers. So we needed to know who to call, and that's why we created the registration process. They have to give us all the contact information we need and say this is the right number to call. And they have to confirm the identification information that's on the carts. That's easy for the big retailers. All of us can look at a cart from the big retailers and know who it belongs to. It may be that some of the other retailers don't have as readily identifiable markings on their cart. So in the registration process, they're going to have to tell us what to look for. But they can choose that. And then we're done. We have to do all the who gets it back part. All the public has to do is say, here's the location of the abandoned cart. So the proposal does not have a specific additional identifier on the carts that includes the request Lakewood or return phone number, that sort of thing. We're going to try to do that through the registration process, which we think will be a little less bureaucratic but just as effective.
May I respond?
Please.
May I respond? A couple things. I appreciate that this is a pilot program so that as we go forward it can be changed as needed. And just a response to what you just said, I still lean towards having some type of ID on the cards because I think for the businesses it gets them a little bit of ownership in this program. And they are part of the process. That way they know that their card is going to come to them rather than King Soopers over here in Belmar or someplace else. So I'd like us to actually consider that.
Thank you for your comment about the retailers that have multiple locations. One thing I didn't mention, and I should have, is that will be an option for the retailer when they register. It'll be clear to them that we're not going to take the cart back to a specific location that it came from because we won't know unless they do exactly as you described. So if they want their carts to go back to the specific store it came from, then they'll have to do exactly as you mentioned, and that'll be clear.
Okay. And also I'd like to thank you for including the map. It took quite a little bit of research to put that together. I've been working on this for close to 4 years to try and come to tonight. And this is obviously an issue that's more prominent in Wards 1 and 2, and to a certain extent 3 as well. Councilman Royball's nodding his head. Wards 4 and 5 don't understand to the same degree what the neighborhoods are dealing with this, because they frankly are a sign of blight. And we're doing everything we can to clean up Colfax. This will make a huge difference, and I just can't thank you enough. Thanks.
Mr. Roybal.
Thank you, Mayor. Jay, thank you again. Just wanted to bring out some points of clarification. Some of the industry has a new system where the wheels, once they pass a certain point, the wheels lock up. So and it's not fail safe. I mean, they can pick up the cart and put it over the electronic wire going across, and then they can push it. But the wheels generally end up locking. And a lot of the stores have come up with this new system. They still have some of the old, carts, and they're still moving. But, here's a thought. When the residents come and they walk down a certain main corridor and they have a cart, and then they get on the bus and they leave. And you were talking about some maybe administrative thoughts on how they work, and you had talked about the goal request. Well, we wanted to make sure that the city or the actual cart owners do not get flim-flam back and forth by a contractor. Well, if you feed them the information, they know exactly where the cart is, so it's already been documented. The other case in point may be that the individual contractor can take a picture of the cart in a certain area, document it, submit it forward, and let them know so it's documented forward that this is where the cart was. So, it's basically administrative, things that they can do. But Overall, when I looked at this, I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was well planned out, and I'm excited for Ward 3.
Great.
That's all I got.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Gutwein.
Thank you. Great job. Thank you so much. And just a couple quick questions. Now I just forgot what the name of that organization is that is potentially coming up with their own solution. The
Colorado Retail Council.
Thank you. Could you explain that again? And if I'm not understanding if they will take action regardless of if we have an ordinance or if it's dependent on the ordinance, or what the relation is there.
I don't know the answer to that question. I've not asked them. They've been involved in discussions. They knew the ordinance was coming. They've known the general outline, and of course have seen it since it went online about 10 days or so ago. I just don't know whether they will go forward with or without the ordinance. I don't know the answer to that question. I am recommending that you go ahead and pass the ordinance. If their program proves adequate, there's no harm done, and it's a backup in case at some point in time they choose to discontinue that.
So their program would work in addition to the ordinance, or if it was so effective, then it would potentially replace this.
It would essentially be a replacement, as I understand it at this point. We don't have enough detail to be certain of that, but I think that's their intent. There's one overlap, and that's the use of the Request Lakewood system. That would still be done. It's a system that the city of Lakewood talks about a lot, so it's well publicized. We'd still have a big publicity push to make people aware that that's the way to report abandoned carts. And the system can simultaneously notify a city staff person and the retail council, or if it's the city's cart collection contractor, that contractor. So it all happens at the same time, but I think that would still be the primary tool for identifying and notifying that there's a cart that needs to be picked up.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then I guess the reason that they would be motivated to continue to do this even if we passed an ordinance is because you said they may see additional cost savings if they don't have to go through the city as a middle man.
I think so. And there are private systems in place in some parts of the country. Generally, they are places that have hundreds of carts a month that get picked up, so this is a little extraordinary. But I think the private sector feels like they can do it at least as cheaply as we can and as efficiently. And on our side, with the ordinance in place, we can ensure that it's at least comparable to what results we would get with the default program.
Okay, great. And then, so the only other question I have is, I didn't understand this when I was reading it the first time. So you were saying that any fees that we collect from the grocery stores, for example, we will not be able to keep that will all get refunded. So
in today's environment of the combination of the constitutional law, Tabor, and the city's financial circumstances, every dollar would not be a net decrease in our cost because it would be part of the refund to the public, the Tabor refund.
Okay. And what is the approximate anticipated cost for running this program?
Kind of hoping nobody to ask. The most expensive for the city would be the default program, and I think the administrative part of that is minor. It would be some part-time employee hours to manage it, essentially. The contractor cost is a bit of an unknown. It's driven by some things that may not. It depends on how the bidding occurs. We're going to hire a private contractor, so we won't know the numbers until we go through that process. Generally speaking, what we've seen from other reports of those costs is a few dollars per cart. So if we're looking at 20 carts a month average that Public Works has picked up. Now that doesn't say that's all of the carts that were out there because the retailers have been picking up carts too. That's maybe $100 a month for the cart contractor. That may be so low that we have trouble getting a contractor, because their expenses aren't related to how many carts they pick up. It's related to how far they have to drive. So I suspect in our case, where the number of carts is low in comparison to some other communities, the cost will probably be higher. That was a long answer to say I don't know. I'm sorry.
Well, that gives me at least. So, I mean, essentially, we're talking about $100 a month as a ballpark figure.
I suspect it'll be higher than that. But it won't be tens of thousands of dollars a year,
Sure.
I don't think either.
Okay. Well, that is really important to me, that the and which you've highlighted in the kind of the goals, is limiting the public cost and the public dollars, and then also limiting the police agent time to as close to zero as possible. Because as just discussed, we do have other, even though we don't have this major issue in Ward 5, I think that there are more important public safety issues, and also more important ways to spend our public funds. So keeping this as low as possible, I think would be great, and I am anxious to hear more about what the private sector wants to do to contribute to this. So thank you very much.
Ms. Vincent.
Okay, as a representative of the person who has the most noise complaints and the highest noise and the most grocery carts, what a week. I would like to say, can we come up with something to move this ordinance forward, Mr. Mayor?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I was just letting everybody speak their piece.
Oh, okay. I just thought, I heard that everybody liked it, so I thought maybe we could move it forward.
Well, my board says different, yes.
Oh, boy, okay.
Equal opportunity. Ms. Harrison. And then, potentially, if nobody else lights up, we can find a consensus.
Okay. Boy, I like it when I get to be the last one. Here's what I would like to propose. Could we do 1-year pilot program with hopes that the private sector will come to the table with a doable thing and get us off the hook? And at the end of the pilot program, we'd have the ability to sunset and unload if we don't like it.
So I'd tackle that. I think that's something we can bring forth at second reading, and if that's something the council wants to do, we can do that. So with that, is there a consensus clearly to move forward? All right, so we'll move forward. You might, if you ever talk to the shopping cart manufacturers, they could team up with Roku, the little vacuum cleaners that find their way back home. Maybe the Roomba, sorry. That's the Benadryl. Thank you. All right. Nice job, Jay. Nice job all night tonight. This is the Jay night. Amara, you are the only one kind of left.
Speak, so they told me to say, and ditto for them when I'm
Oh, great. Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm here to talk about the building code update, and I'm here to talk about section 14.01.060, page 2. So after several years of attending these meetings with you and workshops and ward meetings, I would bet I'm pretty accurate in saying you're not here for your good health. And I would also bet that you haven't spent your hard-earned money, and you haven't to get elected, and you haven't sacrificed your time with family, your income and your jobs, and your personal time to be here. So I think we would probably all agree that you're here for a reason, a passion. You're here to be relevant, and you're here to fulfill the promises you made to your constituents to represent us, to be a voice in the city hall, in this building, for the citizens, because you're it. So therefore, I would like to ask you to review paragraph A, or newly proposed paragraph A, that essentially renders you impotent. The first sentence reads, "The City Council shall by resolution establish or modify fees related to the codes adopted herein." Well, of course. And then the next sentence goes on to say, "But upon application to the city manager may waive or reduce said fees if such action will further the economic goals of the city as set forth," blah, blah, blah. What's the point of setting fees, having you debate them till 11 o'clock at night, representing the will of the people or your own intelligence, if they're just going to be rendered moot by an individual, privately, nothing personal, whatever the individual is in that seat. Why have fees? And then I look down to 2 paragraphs later, and the present provision that City Council shall by resolution establish or modify fees relating to the codes adopted herein is struck, taking you out of the equation altogether. Why? You remain a representatives of the people. So therefore, I ask you to please do not vote away your relevance as it relates to permitting and building fees. I ask you, please do not vote away your protection of citizens from willy-nilly fees, arbitrarily raised, reduced, waived, increased. It's not just waiving fees for favorite developers, a favorite businessman, a cousin, a friend, a neighbor who has lobbied, plied, bribed, whatever, one private individual to waive the structural fees. It is also protecting us from fees. And I ask you to please do not vote in favor of encouraging preferential treatment for individuals who beg to have their fees reduced or waived. They're set for a reason. They should remain fair and equitable to everyone, not individually assessed on a case-by-case basis privately by one individual that is an employee, not a representative of the people. Thank you very much.
All right, I'll close public comment. And I think, if possible, maybe, Ms. Hodson, in fact, I don't think you've ever had the opportunity to do this. I think maybe it comes into play with economic development, but maybe there could be more of an explanation. And maybe Amara could get in touch, or we could get in touch with her and explain a little bit more. I understand where you're coming from, but I think the gist of it is off. And so I think we're going to need some more explanation of that reasoning and what that would entitle and where that comes into play.
We can absolutely do that.
Okay. Thank you very much. All right, reports. I'm going to start with Ms. Harrison.
2 things. I wanted to say that our Ward 5 meeting was absolutely wonderful this Saturday. We had a great group participation where we discussed different planning and developing questions in the city of Lakewood, and it was really good. I would encourage my fellow councilors, if you want to try it, it was really fun. So that was number 1. And then number 2, I wanted to tell my fellow councilors and the watching public to know that I had a hearing today. I had a campaign finance complaint filed against me. I went to the hearing. The hearing will be, the officers will be making that decision. I'd like to thank Adrienne Hannigan for bringing this forward. It is good citizens like Adrienne that bring our mistakes to light. It was an honest mistake on my part. I had no intention of hiding money by any means. I just didn't read the code in the way that she did. So I just want to apologize to the public, and everybody needs to know that the fines will be paid, and I say thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Harrison. I appreciate the way you've handled this. Mr. Roybal?
Thank you, Mayor. Real quick, Saturday we had the opportunity to go to the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce Gala, and let me tell you, that was just awesome. It's getting bigger and bigger every year. This year, there had to be at least 1,000 people there. It was huge, and it was fantastic. And we had our, I'll let Councilor Beta talk a little bit about our ward meeting. Thank you.
Mr. Abel?
Unfortunately, we had to cancel our ward meeting Saturday. It was a matter of good taste. We have our meetings at a local church, and a prominent member of the congregation passed away. And they had the funeral booked. We probably could have squeezed in, but we thought it would be a distraction for our ward members' community to be strolling in and out of the meeting area. So we decided the best thing to do would be to cancel the meeting, and we'll pick back up the first Saturday of next month.
Mr. Skilling?
Our Ward 4 newsletter just went out, getting better thanks to Barb every month. In that newsletter, you'll find all the upcoming goings-on here at Council. That's also going to blend into our Ward 4 meeting this Saturday, 9:30 to 11 a.m., wherein we'll be discussing the priorities that this council came up with at our planning retreat, and then getting feedback similar to how Ward 5 handled their last meeting, trying to get as much feedback as possible from our folks on those priorities so that moving forward with the aggressive schedule that I have envisioned in my head over the next 2 months, that I'll have some insight that I can bring back some specifics, some brainstorming, and look forward to seeing everybody there. And one last thought, if you aren't getting our newsletter, please email or call me so that you can get added onto that. Thank you.
Councilor LeBear.
Alrighty. Well, I'll just say that Alameda Gateway Community Association meeting is on the 7th of March, which is Wednesday, 7:30 to 9 a.m. It's at River Church, 220 South Yarrow Street, and I do plan on being there, so looking forward to that. Also, I would just mention our Ward 2 meeting has been canceled due to I am going to be out of town for a conference, and I think Sharon has a conflict as well, Councilor Vincent, and yeah, thank you.
Ms. Gutwein?
No report.
Mr. Beda?
Very short. We had two great ward meetings, one this morning, one last Saturday. Had good turnouts at both, a lot of participation, and robust discussions. All were very respectful, so thank you all for coming out, and I hope we continue that in the future. That's all.
Ms. Vincent? Ms. Johnson?
No report.
All right, so I'll close. I'll pick up where Mr. Roybal left off as well. Just the Hispanic Chamber event honored a very special friend of Lakewood, resident of Lakewood, one of the first members, I think, on our diversity council. Jerry Natividad received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Hispanic Chamber. So congratulations to Jerry and his family. He's done quite a bit. We will not be here next week. Some of us will be in Washington, D.C., carrying on the torch of Lakewood to our folks in D.C. And as Councilor Skilling mentioned, we have an aggressive schedule. And Council has really tried to make sure that our information is brought to us sooner, so we have more time to prepare, and so staff's done a great job getting that ready. What I would like to have Council do, we have a lot of great questions, and a lot of those questions, all of our directors are available prior to our meetings, and so I just want you to keep that in mind as you review and as you have questions. Please lean on them. There's 11 of us, and we're going to have long meetings for the next few months, so we want to make them as efficient and productive as possible. And with that, we will adjourn at 10:03. Thank you.
Second verse, same as the first. I'm Henry the Eighth, I am. Henry the Eighth, I am.